In this lecture, we're going to talk about insert multi-mesh brushes. So if we go to B for brush, I for insert, we're going to be talking about these brushes here and how to use them both with and without Dynamesh. We're going to create a small mech object using the insert mesh brushes for bolts and nuts. And then later on, we're going to use it in conjunction with Dynamesh to create a creature like this, simply building it up out of primitives and then Dynameshing them together using the insert multi-mesh brushes for primitives as well as body parts. So let's go ahead and get started taking a look at insert multi-mesh brushes. Now we're going to take a look at a specific type of insert mesh brush. If I go to B for brush, I for insert, you see that there's a variety of IMM brush sets here, such as machine parts or industrial parts or model kit. Now these brushes consist of lots of little mechanical pieces. Now you can Dynamesh these into another mesh, but generally they're used to create standalone pieces. If I want to add a sense of scale or complexity to an object, I'll use these and it will add extra geometry that doesn't blend in with the existing mesh. Because you don't necessarily want to Dynamesh little hard surface pieces together like that. I find, far easier to keep your fasteners separate. So brushes like this have a tendency to be used in that capacity. For example, model kit. Again, these are all nice little hard surface greebles, just little surface details you can use to add extra bits of information to a model. So here I've got a mesh that was created using live Boolean. I'm going to turn on my X symmetry and let's put some fasteners on here. I'll select from the model kit brush this fastener, which is a nut, a bolt, and a washer. If I click and drag, it'll draw onto the canvas. Let's undo that and do it again. Let's select this one. Click and drag, and that draws onto the canvas. Now, you'll notice that it masks the rest of the model. That's so I can select the transpose gizmo, and then I can move these things around individually, independently of the mesh that I drew them on. Clear the background, or clear the mask, and they're now part of the model. Now, they're still separate parts. If I go into frame mode, you can see these actually are separate pieces, but they're in the same subtool. Now, when we're drawing fasteners like this, often we want them all to be the same size. It would be very strange if we drew a bunch of nuts and bolts and they were not the same size. So what I do is I change my draw size, turn it down, click and drag, and as I'm drawing, press the Control key, and it will snap it to the draw size of my brush. So let's do that again. Let's add another fastener here. We'll put two fasteners right here, click and drag, and then press Control, and it will snap to the size of my brush. It locks into that size, let go, and there we go. We'll do two more here. Press Control and that locks them into the correct size. So let's add some more pieces down here. Let's select a different part now. Let's grab this coupler here. This is an interesting shape. I will click and drag. If I press Control, it snaps it to the size of my brush. If I want to change that, I just undo, turn my brush size up, click and drag, and then press Control, and it snaps it to that larger size. Let's come over here. So we're on X symmetry right now. We should be able to draw another one right here. Press Control, and it snaps to the same size, but it's a little bit in the wrong position here, so I'm going to go to W for Move, unlock the gizmo, and just reset it, and then we'll just scooch it over here ever so slightly so it's sitting in the right position. And there we go. Clear our mask, and let's take a look at some other parts. We'll go to B for brush, I for insert multi-mesh, and go to, let's say, industrial parts. Grab a pipe. If we rotate over to this side here, click and drag, press the Control key. Again, it locks that to the size of my brush. So we've added a pipe on this side. If we were to, let's say, change our symmetry, let's undo that. And let's go to go to Transform, and let's change to Z symmetry, and then we'll do this again. Let's change our draw size. Let's make it a bit bigger. Click and drag, and then press the Control key, and that will snap that brush to the correct size. Go to W for Move, and we can scooch those up, and maybe I just want to countersink them into the model just a little bit. Then clear the mask. Now, if I go into frame mode, you see all of our insert mesh brushes have a separate polygroup. So if I want to change these, I can always Control-Shift-Click on that polygroup, mask it, and then invert the mask and go back to our gizmo. Maybe I want to rotate these 90 degrees or 180 degrees. We'll rotate them by 180 degrees, scooch them down, and now they're pointing in a different direction. So the insert multi-mesh brushes are extremely powerful, and if they're being used just as independent parts such as this, or if they're being blended into a mesh using Dynamesh, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now, each one of these meshes, you'll notice it has a specific orientation when it's drawn on the surface. That is to say that when I draw one of these bolts, the bolt draws onto the surface in the correct orientation. It's sitting face down against that surface. The orientation that your insert multi-mesh brush draws in is based on the orientation of the model when the brush is created. So we'll talk about how to create our own brushes, and you'll understand what I mean by that. Each one of these objects has its own orientation at the time the brush was stored. Now also, you need to make sure that you're only using these on a mesh that has a single subdivision level. Now, if you still need to see your mesh smoothed, you can't always use dynamic subdivision levels, and we talk about this more in the chapter on ZModeler. If I press the D key, which you'll remember is the hotkey to step up your subdivision levels, if I have no subdivision levels, it's going to ask me if I want to use dynamic subdiv. So I'll say yes, and now you see that those faceted parts are now smooth. Now, if I want to change the settings of my dynamic subdivision levels, I'll go to the Geometry menu, and I'll go to Dynamic Subdivisions. And here I can adjust things like the flat subdivision levels, just that, and that changes the nature of that smooth. I can also apply this. So if I'm happy with my work, I like what I've got. Let's do another piece here, though, before we move on. Let's grab this piston, which if I were to turn off dynamic subdivision levels and draw this piston, you'll see what we end up with. We'll click and drag. That draws the piston. You see the piston is faceted by design. Let's rotate that and scale it down just a bit. And let's center the pivot. And then let's send it to the home so we can actually make sure that it's perfectly centered. Bring that out and then just countersink that in a little bit. Now, clear my mask and you see that everything that is faceted. However, if I turn back on my dynamic subdivision levels, those faceted pieces now appear smooth. So this allows us to use insert multi-mesh brushes on a hard surface object that doesn't have subdivision levels but is giving us a sense of smoothing, so we can see what it will properly look like. Now when I'm happy with this, I click apply, and that has now applied that as subdivision levels to the model. Now I would only want to do that if I've decided that I'm finished adding in insert multi-mesh brushes, because again, you cannot use insert mesh brushes on a mesh that has multiple subdivision levels. So let's take a look now at how we create our own insert meshes. So here I have a slightly more complicated version of our previous model. It's a single subtool. It's been created using live Boolean, so it's been Boolean meshed down into one object. You see that it actually has 33,000 faces, and that's something to consider when you create an insert mesh brush. If it's too high density and you're planning on using lots of them, then that's going to add up. So you may actually want to go in here and decimate this. I don't have the lines turned on polyframe. So if we turn on the lines, you can see the polyframe lines here. So if something gets a bit too dense, you may consider decimating it before you turn it into an insert mesh brush. Now, when I generate an insert mesh brush, I need to be aware of the orientation of the model when I store it as a brush. So for example, all these brushes up here, you remember the flathead, for example, this draws in a specific orientation. Well, that's because this was stored when it was created as a brush in that orientation. So the way we orient our model is to consider the background, the surface of the mesh that this insert mesh brush will be drawn onto. So if I store my mesh like this, it will draw with this facing out. If I store my mesh like this, it will draw with the side facing down. If I store my mesh like this, it will draw upside down. So let's begin by orienting it like this. And then we simply go to Brush, Create Insert Mesh. And we want to make a new insert mesh brush right there. So now if I click and drag, it draws that new tool or that new brush in that stored orientation. Now if I want to change the depth at which it draws, I go to Brush, Depth, and then I change this depth control. And now if I click and drag, you see it actually draws deeper into the surface. Now let's say this is an object that I actually want to store various orientations of. If I change to this orientation and then go to Brush, Create Insert Mesh, I have the option to append it. So if I append it, it is now a second version stored in this single brush. And maybe we want one that draws upside down, so we'll orient it this way and go to Brush, Create, Create Insert Mesh, Append. So now I have an Insert Mesh brush with 3 different orientations. So if I select one, draw it, then I can select another one, draw that, select this one, draw that. You see each one draws at a different orientation. Now, there's another way of creating an insert multi-mesh brush, and this I find very, very handy. Here I've got a model of a human skeleton where each bone is a separate subtool. Now, if I want, I can create an insert multi-mesh brush from this Z tool simply by going to Brush, Create, and this time click Create Insert Multi-Mesh. And it's going to take a moment to think about it. And now here you see we have an insert multi-mesh brush for all these parts. If I click and drag, let's go back to our piece here that it just has one subdivision level. Click and drag, I'm drawing skulls. If I select this one, I'm drawing scapulas. If I select this one, I'm drawing the, looks like that is the radius bone. Grab this one. There we have our humerus. So each one of these is a separate bone, and that each one of those are extracted from the individual subtools of that mesh. So it's quite an interesting opportunity here to create some very macabre abstract art. Clear my mask, and there we go. Now let's take a look at using insert mesh brushes with Dynamesh. I'll begin by going to the light box, and under the tool menu within the light box, I'll just select a polysphere. We'll draw that on the canvas and go into edit mode. Make sure that we're looking down the Z-axis with our guide head here, and turn on X symmetry. Now we're just going to use Dynamesh and insert mesh brushes to create a creature head. I'll begin by creating an egg shape from the front. We'll snap to a side view and create an egg shape or create the cranial mass from the side. Do a little bit of smoothing here. Snap to a top view, and let's create an egg shape from the top. I'll step down a couple subdivision levels. We're still in subdivision sculpting mode, and I like to start in that mode. If you've watched the quick start or any of the other sculpting demos, you'll see I talk a lot about the importance of subdivision levels for getting good basic form before we move into Dynamesh. So let's just get an interesting shape here. I'll go to the magnify brush, do a little bit of magnification here. Let's turn down the Z intensity on that brush so it's not quite so strong. And I'll go back to my move brush, stretch these shapes down. Now once I've got a generalized form established, I'll go to Geometry. I will go to the Dynamesh menu, and here I can set my resolution for Dynamesh. Right now it defaults at 128, so if I press the Dynamesh button here, it notices that I have subdivision levels and it asks me if I want to freeze them. I'll just tell it no. I just want to do a clean Dynamesh here. Go into frame mode and you can see what it's done. If I undo that and then do it again, it's basically dynamically subdivided the model, creating a whole bunch of little quads, evenly spaced, to represent that shape based on the 128 resolution. So I'm just going to hit it with the smooth brush to take away those facets, because those facets don't exist as polygons anymore. They're just baked in because those were the shapes when I generated my mesh. So let's create a neck. Turn my draw size down and press the Control key to activate the masking brush, and we'll just mask out where the neck will come from. Control click on the background to invert that mask and take the move brush, and I'll just stretch those faces down for the neck. Control click and drag once to execute Dynamesh. If we go into frame mode, you'll see when I control click and drag again, that executes Dynamesh. So Dynamesh is dynamic subdivision, dynamic remeshing. So what happens is each time I control click and drag on the background, it will rebuild my mesh to this resolution that I've established here. So I've got sort of a basic shape going. Now let's put in a torso. I'll go to B for brush, I for insert, and we're back in the IMM brushes here. Now, previously we were using the nuts and bolts, the IMM brushes that are really specifically for meshes that are not being dynameshed. Now I'm going to select IMM primitives, and this is just a selection of primitive meshes here. If I select Sphere 32, click and drag, it draws a sphere here on the canvas. Let's do this again. Let's go ahead and click and drag, draw a sphere. There we go. Now it masks out the mesh that I drew it from. If I go to W for move, I can click and drag and position the sphere. Go to my move brush, and now I'll just start shaping this into a torso. Just want to get the general volumes of rib cage here. Let's create the thoracic arch there. Let's go to E for scale. Let's scale it up a little bit, bring this down. Go back to our move brush. Look at it from the underside and just make sure that we get a nice peak to the rib cage here. All right, now if we go into frame mode, you'll see this sphere is a separate object from the Dynamesh that we've been working on. The Dynamesh is currently masked. Every time I use an insert mesh brush, it will mask the mesh that I'm inserting it into. So the first step is to control click and drag on the background to clear the mask. Now anytime Dynamesh is turned on, if I control click and drag on the background again with no mask, it will Dynamesh those parts. So you see it's just blended those two pieces together. They've maintained their polygrouping, but they are now a single mesh. So I'll just come back here, do a little bit of smoothing on this, and here we go. So let's add some shoulders in. I'll go to B for brush, I for insert, and go back to my IMM primitives. I'll take that same sphere, and this time I will click and drag, and that will draw two spheres for shoulders. W for move, I'll just place these. And then I'll take the move brush once again, and I'm just going to pull out the suggestion of clavicles here. And from the back, I'll take my move brush, and I will suggest the scapulas. Let's lower these down a little bit. And then I'll take the move brush and just push in the underside there of the deltoid. I want to make sure that there's some depth to that armpit. So I can use these primitives to build up a character, primitive by primitive, in its most basic volumes. And it's a very, very valuable way of working. It's one of my favorite ways of sculpting, actually, is to establish these basic shapes first and foremost by building them up with sort of virtual balls of clay like this. Control click and drag once clears the mask. Control click and drag a second time Dynameshes these parts together. So if I smooth, we can smooth those transitions. I'll take the move brush and continue to sort of adjust these shapes. Now let's look at a different insert multi-mesh brush. I'll do B for brush, I for insert. And we have one here called IMMB parts. That's body parts. And you see this is a selection of all sorts of different body parts here. I'm going to grab the full arm. Click and drag, and that draws a full arm. But the orientation obviously isn't quite right. So we'll press E to bring up our gizmo. And then we'll rotate and move and scale these. So let's hold down the Alt key and we'll change the pivot point up here to the shoulder. We'll scale the arms up. Maybe rotate them down just a bit. Rotate them forward and position. Now I want these arms to be a little bit more slender and a little bit more creaturey, so to speak. Let's go to move, and I still have the mesh masked that I'm inserting this into. So here I'm able to just use the move brush to kind of adjust these shapes. I want to make sure that that deltoid or that bicep tucks up under the deltoid there. And now I'm going to mask out this area here. I'll go back to my gizmo and I'll turn off the gizmo so I have the transpose line now. And I will click and drag to draw a new transpose line. Move the transpose line so it's basically running right down the axis of the arm. And I'll go to W for move and I'll grab the outermost circle and I can just stretch those arms down a bit. And let's mask down to the forearm. And I'll do the same thing here. I'll draw a new transpose line from the elbow out. And I just want to make sure that it's actually running along the axis of that forearm. I kind of place the transpose line where the bone would be. W for move, and just grab the outermost circle to stretch that down. And it has the added benefit that it kind of elongates the fingers a bit. Now I'll clear my mask. And I still want to do some changes to these arms. I don't want to Dynamesh them yet. So if I go into frame mode, you see it's a separate polygroup. So I can Control-Shift-Click on it, mask them, and then invert the mask so I still have the Dynamesh masked. I will mask out the hands, mask out the shoulders, and I'm going to go to Deformation under the Tool menu. And there is an Inflate slider here, and I'm just going to turn that Inflate slider down ever so slightly, and that will make those arms a little bit more slender. Clear my mask, and now I'm going to mask out the hands and invert that mask. I'm going to take my move brush and just sort of stretch out these fingers a little bit. Now when we're Dynameshing, if your resolution is not set high enough, things like fingers and toes may very well blend together. If you find that problem where your fingers are sort of blending into each other, increase your resolution in your Dynamesh by going to Geometry, Dynamesh, and increase the resolution. Or what I like to do is go to my transpose line, hold down the Control key, and click and drag, and that masks based on topology. You can see this in the transpose chapter. I'll draw a new transpose line ending the circle at the joint of the knuckle, go to R for rotate, and hold down the Alt key and just click and drag. And what I'm doing here is I'm spreading these fingers out just a little bit. I think it'll make it a lot easier for us to actually sculpt the hands if the fingers are a little bit spread, and helps us get a more expressive shape. Hold down the Alt key and I'll spread that index finger out, and then I'll mask down to the ring finger and do the same. I will rotate that ring finger out slightly. Now I draw a new transpose line and go to W for move, and let's stretch that ring finger out. Let's mask down to the middle finger, stretch that middle finger out, and mask down to the index finger, and we can stretch that index finger out again, just using the last circle in the move brush. Now, since it's a creature, I think it might be interesting if the carpals were a little bit longer, so we'll stretch those a bit. Actually, I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to use the middle circle here. Hold down the Shift key, and I can stretch the length of that hand. Clear my mask, and I'll just use the move brush to do a little bit of adjustment to the shapes of the fingers here. And there we go. So we've got the hand shapes change now. It's a bit larger. It's a nice kind of stylization. Of course, if I wanted to overall change that, I could mask it, go to my gizmo. We'll turn the gizmo back on here, and you can actually change your scale here using your scale slider. Now, if I Control, click, and drag once, it will clear the mask. Control, click, and drag a second time. I'll turn on frame mode so you can see this. It will Dynamesh these arms into the torso. And here we are. So we're building up a character bit by bit, doing what some people call kit bashing, which is just taking various bits and pieces from other models and blending them together. So here actually I've got a little mistake. You can see where those bits of the arm extend out. So what I'll do is I'll mask that, invert the mask, and I'll just take the Clay Tubes brush and hold down the Alt key, and that just pushes those in. Let's turn off the alpha, and then I'll just smooth that area out a little bit. Smooth that back, and then I'll Dynamesh it again, and you see it will actually correct that area. I treat Dynamesh as a tool for generating volumes. I use it to sketch out characters, but once I have the overall volume of my character established, then I like to leave Dynamesh mode and go back into subdivision modeling mode, which we'll talk about a bit more later. Let's go ahead and bring this down to the pelvis. We'll do a torso for this character. I'll do B for brush, I for insert, and go back to my IMM primitives. Select a sphere, and I'll just draw in a sphere here for the abdomen. Take the move brush, and I'll start to shape this. I'll bring that abdomen down. And here I'll start to suggest the iliac crest. That's the uppermost crest of the pelvis. Bring this down to the pubic bone. Bring that up into the thoracic arch. And let's bring this out here. This will be the lateral oblique, the flank muscle. Let's go to the standard brush and just push in a little bit there for the lumbar spine. And let's invert the mask. And I'm just going to push in a little bit here for the spine itself, because that does go in. Suggest our 7th cervical vertebrae there. And then we'll invert the mask again, take our move brush, and just transition these shapes together a little bit better. There we go. Then when I'm happy with that, I Control, click, and drag once to clear the mask. Control, click, and drag a second time, and that blends these two pieces together, Dynameshing them into one form. Now, lastly, we'll put in the pelvis. So I'll go to B for brush, I for insert, and let's go back to our primitives. We'll take that same sphere and just draw two spheres here for the buttocks. We'll use the gizmo to move them together. Go to our move brush, and now we're just going to basically fill out the muscles that attach to the pelvis and the legs. That'd be the tensor fasciae lata and the rectus femoris and vastus lateralis and medialis. Let's get that all down in here. Get the shape of the gluteus maximus here. Control, click, and drag twice, and that will blend these two shapes together. This is very similar to how I would sculpt in clay. I would roll out balls of clay and put together the basic shapes, the basic volumes of a character first and foremost, and then smooth between them. So bring this pelvis back a little bit, and there we go. So now we can start sculpting in the shapes of the head. I'll go to the clay tubes brush once again, and I'll begin just by creating that sternocleidomastoid muscle, the biggest muscle, the neck, that attaches to the clavicles and to the mastoid process of the skull. Now, if I go into frame mode, this is quite dense, and I really don't need this much density for the type of sculpting that I'm doing right now because I'm just basically roughing in forms. So if I want to change my resolution, I'll come back here to the Dynamesh resolution and maybe turn it down to 80. I'll just touch the model once and then control, click, and drag, and it will Dynamesh again, but this time it will reduce the overall polygon count. See, that's reduced now. I could bring that down further if I bring it to, let's say, 50, well, 48. Touch the model and then control, click, and drag. And you see that begins to really reduce that overall polygon count. Let's set it to 32. Control, click, and drag, and there we go. Now we've got a nice sort of basic shape. The fingers have been spread out. We want to make sure as we're Dynameshing that we don't end up losing fingertips or getting holes in places, because that is a danger when you start to lower your resolution. But now my smoothing works much, much better. So I'm just going to smooth out these shapes here. Let's go in with our standard brush. Let's create eye sockets. Take our clay tubes brush, start to suggest some bone structure here like a muzzle, cheekbones, temporal ridge of the skull. Let's go ahead and mass out that cranium again. Let's get an interesting shape here. We'll go back to our magnify brush, turn up our draw size, and just do a little bit of magnification here. Take the move brush and let's pull this out into kind of a crest. Spread those eyes out. Come to the back and let's just spread the cranial mass out. Go to the top. Always work from various angles too. Make sure that you're not constantly working from the front view of your character, because that will be very, very misleading to you. I'm going to go to my clay tubes brush and turn the Z intensity down. Just hold down the Alt key to create the planes on the side of the head here. Go to our clay tubes brush and build up these cheekbones again. Get that structure of the skull. Clay tubes brush for this muzzle. We're going to put tentacles on the face here, so it's not going to be sort of a standardized mouth. I want to start creating just a sense of there being some kind of bone structure here. Even though it's an alien structure, I just want it to feel like there's some physiological truth, there's some physiological motivation for the shapes that we're making. So I'm pulling what I know about facial anatomy and trying to incorporate that into this sort of alien shape. Take our move brush, open those up, take the clay tubes brush, and let's just build up this muzzle shape here. I'll go to my damn standard brush, and I'm just going to carve out this shape here. I'm just going to push these shapes up inside the mouth, smooth that back a bit. Maybe we'll just go ahead and mask this area. Invert that mask and take the move brush and just tug them up and in. And then control, click, and drag twice, and it will Dynamesh those shapes. Take our move brush and let's pull that out. And let's go with our clay tubes brush and let's put some ears on here. I'm going to mask out the shape of the ear. Now, when we're getting into details like this, we might actually need to increase our resolution. So we'll have to go back up in our resolution. I've just unmasked the shape of the ear, and I'll take the move brush and just pull that shape out, like so. Pull that out from the head so it's sitting at a bit of an angle. Control, click, and drag twice, and that will dynamically subdivide. It will dynamically remesh that. Take our standard brush, and let's just hold down the Alt key and just push in the inner ear a little bit. Take the move brush, tug the earlobe down, tweak the shape of that ear. Let's take the inflate brush and let's inflate those earlobes and pull them down a little bit so they're a little bit sort of pendulous. Let's take our move brush and I'm just going to adjust these cheekbones a little bit. Pull out the brow and pull out the frontal eminence of the skull here just a little bit. I'm going to mask out the face. Control click on that mask to feather the edge, and then I'll just hold down the Alt key and I'll just pull those brow shapes forward. And that just gives us a bit more interesting silhouette there, a little bit more going on in the overall profiles. Let's bring this muzzle shape out a little bit more. And let's spread these out just a bit. Going with my damn standard brush, I'm just going to put a little crease through here. Just put some little details in here, and maybe this is the esophagus or the mouth right under there. We're going to have tentacles coming out of the face here in just a moment, in case you're wondering what's going on with this strange thing that we're making. I'm just going to put a little bit of detail here inside of those eye sockets. And now I think we could increase our resolution just a little bit. So I'll go to my resolution slider and I'll set this back to 50. Go into frame mode, and if I control, click, and drag, you see that that automatically increases my resolution. So we'll leave frame mode, do a little bit of smoothing in the ear. And I'm going to mask out the inner portion of the ear here. Invert that mask, take the clay tubes brush, and we'll create the inside part of the ear called the antihelix. That's the little Y-shaped portion of the ear you'd be familiar with. It's got the little divot right here. We're just going to build that up. Invert that mask, and I just want to build out the outermost portion of the ear, which is called the helix. And then we'll dynamesh that. Do a little bit of smoothing on it. Take our standard brush and I'll push in the ear hole. That's called the auditory meatus. And I'll take the move brush and I'll pull out a little divot of skin right here. That's called the tragus. Hit that with the inflate brush and then execute dynamesh. Now here you see, because it was a low resolution, those two parts blended together. So I'm going to undo that and just take my move brush and just pull this slightly away. I want to make sure that these two parts don't blend together too much. Now I could correct that by just increasing my resolution again. That is another option. Go to my damn standard brush, accentuate that crease between the helix and antihelix. And we've got the ability to make this a little bit of an alien ear. It doesn't have to be a perfectly human ear, but I do like to base things in some kind of biological reality. There we go. Smooth that just a little bit. Now, I could add eyeballs here and merge them in using the IMM primitives. If I just selected a sphere, I could just insert spheres here and use these as eyeballs themselves. I'm not going to do that though, but I am going to use them as eyelids. So I'm going to place these inside the eye sockets like so, and control, click, and drag twice, and that will blend them in. Now I'll do a little bit of smoothing along that transitional edge. Now I'm going to go to Subtool, Append, and I'm going to append a polystar. Select that polystar and go into Move Gizmo, bring it forward. Hit the little gear icon here and we'll change that sphere into a polysphere. Add a subdivision level or two. We're not going to dynamesh these eyeballs into the head. We're going to leave them separate. I'll turn on transparency, and I basically want to get them placed just behind that eyeball sphere that we just inserted. I'll scale them down just a tick and just make sure that they're sitting just behind that eyeball. I'll select the body again. Let's turn off transparency. Now at this stage, I really do need to add more geometry. So again, I don't add subdivision levels because I'm in Dynamesh mode. I simply increase my Dynamesh resolution. So let's bring it up to 100, 104. Control, click, and drag. and that will increase the Dynamesh resolution. Use my masking brush now to mask the shape of an open eye. And let's Control-Alt to erase out the mask where we've overpainted it. And for the bottom here as well, we just want to adjust that shape of that open eye. Control-click on the background to invert that mask, and take the Move brush, hold down the Alt key, and then you can push those faces in, revealing the eyeball subtool. I'll leave that little white bit there, invert my mask by Control-clicking on the background, go to the Standard brush, and build up the shapes around that. That's called the medial canthus. Sometimes it's called the tear duct. It's a nice little landmark on the eye. Take the Inflate brush and inflate that thickness of the eyelid. Go to the Clay Tubes brush, build up into the recess there. Let there be a little bit of a soft tissue or an eye bag here. Go to my damp Standard brush and put a little bit of a crease right through here. And then we'll execute Dynamesh, and you see that it will rebuild this area. And we can hit it with a little bit of smooth now. Now I want to mirror that eyeball over, so I'll go back to my Subtool menu, select the eyeball. I'll go to Z Plugin, Subtool Master, Mirror, and I want to merge into one subtool across the X-axis. Click OK, and now I've got two eyeballs merged into a single subtool. Let's select the body again, take the Move brush, and let's just play around with the shapes that we're getting. Let's mask out this muzzle. Once again, Control-click on the mask to feather it, and I just want to furrow these brow shapes down a little bit. I'm going to mask out the inside of the eye area and Control-click on that mask a couple times to feather it. And from the top view, I just want to make sure that that brow bone comes out far enough. We can tuck this down a little bit and just add a little bit of sort of malicious intent. We'll invert that mask and let's bring this up. Go to our damp Standard brush and just create a couple little creases here. Always in the brow area, I turn off my X symmetry. Let's turn down the Z intensity on that damp Standard brush. I always try and make sure that the brow furrow is asymmetrical, because they can be similar, but they're very, very rarely perfectly symmetrical. And I think it really helps if you make a concerted effort early on to make some areas like this asymmetrical. It's just going to make the piece look a lot better. I'm going to take the Move brush and just pull that medial canthus forward just a little bit. Almost suggests a nictating membrane there. I'm going to leave a little bit of that. I will mask out the corner of the lower lid. Go to my Clay Tubes brush. I need to zoom in for this. I just want to build up that outer corner of that lid. Bring that around. Put a little bit of fatty tissue under here. Just want to fill out these shapes just a little bit so we get a sense of the eyelid creasing over the lower lid. There we go. And I'll zoom out a little bit so I can Control-click on the background to invert that mask. Take the Move brush and I'll just tug the lower lid up under the upper lid just a little bit, and then execute Dynamesh. So it's quite nice to sculpt this way because you don't need to worry about your subdivision levels. You don't need to worry about, most importantly, the volumes of the model. If I was trying to sculpt all of this from a single sphere, it would not be very easy. I wouldn't be able to extrapolate an entire body from that. So I'm going to come back in with my damp Standard brush, make sure I turn my X symmetry back on, turn up my Z intensity a little bit. And I'm going to create some striations from the cheekbone coming down into this flap area here. Let's spread these out once again. And let's bring this down and out, and let's add some tentacles. Now for that, we're going to use a different brush. We're going to go to B for brush, C for curve. And here we have the Curve Tube brush. Now this is also an insert mesh brush. It can be used just like the other insert meshes where it's used with or without Dynamesh. In this case, we're going to create tentacles with it. I'm going to save my work before we move on. Now that we've saved our work, let's go back to this Curve Tube brush and demonstrate how this works. If I click and drag with the curve brush selected, you see what it does is it creates this dotted line, and along that dotted line it creates a tube. Now if I turn up my draw size, that dotted line has fewer dots in it, and the mesh gets larger. If I change my draw size while my cursor is red and then touch that curve, it changes the size of the mesh. Now, while my brush is over the curve, you notice that it's blue. That means I can grab the endpoints of the curve and move them. I can change my draw size, and I can affect the shape of the curve itself. Now, if I change my draw size over here while my brush is red, that changes the size of the mesh. So what we want to do is we want to use these tubes to create some tentacles coming out of the face here. So let's undo back before we drew those curves. We're on the curved tube brush, and let's draw the first set of tentacles here. I'm going to click and drag and just draw a tube coming out of the mouth here. I'm going to take the start point and I'm going to bring it up inside these mouth sort of flaps here, like that. Now, obviously they don't look like tentacles yet. They look like, regular tubes. So I'm going to go to the stroke menu, and we'll tear off the stroke menu and dock it on the side of the screen. We'll open up the curve menu here, and you see that we've got some options for the curve menu. Now, if snap is turned on, it will cause the endpoints or the points of the curve to snap to the surface. I have that turned off so I can take those endpoints and move them inside the head. I can lock the start and lock the endpoint. So I'm going to lock the start point because I'm happy with where that is now. That means I can grab the endpoint and I can move it around, and that start point stays in its position. Now I will go to curve modifiers. Under curve modifiers, I have the size option here. I'm going to click size and click curve fall off. Now this point represents the size of the mesh at the start point, and this represents the size of the mesh at the end point. I'm going to flip this vertically so it goes from big to small, because that's the start point and that's the end point. So once that's turned on, just click the mesh, and there you can see it changes the taper. Maybe I don't want it to taper down to a perfect point, so I'll bring the end point up slightly and then tap the mesh again, and it starts to feel a little bit more tentacle-ish. There we are. So if I'm happy with that, I'll just tap somewhere off the model, and that curve now goes away. And this is now a mesh that I can manipulate with the move brush. If I want to come in here and just do some tweaks to this before I dynamesh it, I can do that. Maybe we want to bring these up like that. And then I will control click and drag once on the background. Control click and drag once more to execute dynamesh. And now these tentacles, if we go into frame mode, you can see they're part of the mesh. So let's do that again. Let's create some smaller ones. We'll go back to our curve brush, B for brush, C for curve, grab curve tube, and let's do some smaller ones here. I'll turn my draw size down and just draw some smaller tentacles here. We'll take that end point and let's bring it inside the head. Now I still have the start point locked, so I can bring these down and change their shape. Now these are being drawn symmetrically, and if I wanted to draw them asymmetrically, I could definitely do that. I would just turn off X symmetry, and then I would be working asymmetrically. With tentacles, just like with fingers and toes, you want to be careful that your resolution is high enough that it doesn't merge them together. Let's do this. Now, if I want to extend that curve, I can go to stroke and I can turn on, under curve mode, turn on elastic. If I grab the end point now, I can stretch it out. Or I can grab a point along the length of the curve, and it will stretch in between those 2 points. Now if I'm happy with that, tap somewhere off the model, or off the curve, that gets rid of the curve, and then control, click and drag twice, and that will merge those together. Just hit that with a little bit of smooth, and there we go. Now maybe I want to work asymmetrically for the rest of these. I'll go back to my curve tube brush. Let's turn off X symmetry. And let's go ahead and draw a few more tentacles coming out of the mouth. I find it quite easy, if I want to work into a tight area like this, to make a proxy object. I will append a polymesh star into the model. I will select it, and I will turn that into a polysphere. I'll take that polysphere and I'll place it inside the mouth here, where I want those tentacles to come from. I'll turn on X symmetry. And I'll just spread this out. Oops. Make sure I'm on the move brush. I'll use the move brush to spread this out. This is just going to be a proxy object from which I'm going to grow my tentacles. There we go. Now, turn on solo mode and go back to my curve tube brush. Turn off X symmetry and let's just draw a few smaller tentacles coming out of this. Turn off solo so we can see where that's going. I'll go to the stroke menu and I'll turn off elastic and I'll grab that endpoint and let's just bring this down, make these feel like they're coming down like this. If I'm happy with that, I'll go back up to my curve menu, go to curve functions, and there is a snapshot button here. If I press snapshot, it snapshots that curve, so I can grab the end point now, and you see that first tentacle is where I left it. It's been snapshotted there. I'll grab this one, and let's make some changes to this shape. There, we're getting an asymmetrical tentacle now. We'll snapshot that. We'll grab this end point, or we can just grab the curve itself. Move this curve so we can have these sort of interacting a little bit. Let's bring this one like this, like so, and snapshot that. We'll grab that start point and move it over here so we're getting this tentacle coming from a different area. Maybe these are kind of like rolling over each other a little bit, but be careful not to get them too close together or you run the risk of them merging when you Dynamesh. And again, if that does happen, simply increasing your resolution of your Dynamesh will correct that problem. There we go. We'll snapshot that. Now let's create another one. Let's make this one a bit shorter. We'll bring this down deeper inside the mouth. I have to grab that endpoint, so I have to zoom in here and get that endpoint. Let's turn on solo so we can see it a bit easier. There we go. Let's bring that down. Let's turn our draw size up and let's change this curve here. Let's turn off solo so we can see where this is coming from. Make sure that those are not crashing into any of the other tentacles. When we're happy with that, we can snapshot that, and then let's move this one more time. We'll make one more. I'll go to solo so I can actually get that endpoint a bit easier. Bring it up here. Let's make this one sort of reach out. So it's reaching out to say hello with its little mouth tentacles. Maybe that's how it smells things. Maybe it's trying to decide if we're food or not. Turn our draw size down while the brush is blue. That allows us to change the shape of the curve brush. Let's turn off solo so we can see where this is sitting. It's a bit too centralized, so I'm going to move this over just a little bit. Again, taking care to make sure that it doesn't stray too close to the other tentacles or touch them. Quite happy with that, so we'll snapshot it. And then we'll do one more coming from the other side. Turn off solo so we get a clear idea of where these are going in relation to all the other bits and pieces that we've added. Let's bring this way. Let's bring this up. And there we go. So we've got a series of these tentacles now. Tap somewhere off the model. Control, click, and drag to clear the mask. Now this is not Dynameshed yet. I'll go back to my subtool menu. Take these tentacles and let's step them up. Now I could leave this as a separate subtool, but what I do want to do is I want to merge them together with the body. So I'm going to go into solo mode. I want to get rid of this proxy object, that sphere that I use to actually draw these tentacles. So I'll Control-Shift-Click on it twice to hide it. Then I will go to Geometry, Modify Topology, and press Delete Hidden, and that deletes that piece. Now if we turn off solo, like I said, it's perfectly reasonable to go ahead and keep these tentacles as a separate subtool if you want to, and then merge them down later, or just continue to keep them separate. It sort of depends on what your aims are and what your final product is going to be. I would like them to actually be merged into the mesh. Just that's the way I'm going to work with it, and I think it'll be nice to see it that way, and for you to see it work that way. So I'm going to go back to the body, and let's go to Geometry and check our resolution. So we'll go to Dynamesh, Z-Remesher, excuse me, not ZRemesh, Dynamesh, and our resolution is 104. Now these tentacles are kind of close together, so I think we could benefit from increasing our resolution. So I'm going to turn the resolution slider up to say 432, and then we'll execute Dynamesh, and that's going to give us a lot more resolution on this mesh. Now I'm going to go to Subtool. I'm going to come up here to the Tentacle subtool, and I'm going to go to Merge, Merge Down, and click OK. Now that merged this into the Dynamesh. Go to my Geometry menu, and you'll notice that's turned Dynamesh off. So let's bring this back up to, I think that was 432, and then Dynamesh. And there you go. It is now Dynamesh those tentacles in. And you'll notice because I had my resolution set so high, it didn't merge them together except in this part here where they're literally sitting right next to each other. But for the purposes of like a design sculpt like this, it's not a problem. We'll go ahead and smooth these, take away those facets. And then we'll go to our damn standard brush, turn on X symmetry, and we can create some interesting little shapes along the length of these main tentacles here. I just want to create some sort of twisting striations along the length of this, just to add some visual interest. And I'm going to use the damn standard brush to put a little bit of creasing through here, some sort of interesting organic shapes, just to break up this area and make it feel a bit more interesting. And there we go. I'm going to turn down my Z intensity just a little bit, and I'm just going to come up here and do a little bit of wrinkling and detailing here through the sides of the head. I like to sketch with the damn standard brush, just sort of drawing in the direction that I think the wrinkles would flow or the flesh would fold, just to help break things up and get an idea of where pieces and shapes will go. Turn off X symmetry once I get towards the center line of the head. Always try and do that. Like your main volumes, your main sort of skeletal structure can be symmetrical. Doesn't hurt to add a little bit of asymmetry there, but any sort of details or things like that, I try and be quite asymmetrical in that area. So we'll mask into the eye sockets here, or not mask, pardon me, use the clay tubes brush to create some eye bags here, and then let's return to the rest of the body. So I'd like to give some anatomy here to the shoulder, so I'm going to go back to my Insert Primitives brush, and I'll select that insert sphere, click and drag, and we're going to create pectoralis muscles. We'll take these and move them into position. Take the Move brush, and I'm going to take the pectoralis muscle, and I'm going to press it up against the clavicle here because it actually has 3 heads. It has a head that attaches to the clavicle. It has a head that attaches to the sternum. And then the tail of it, so to speak, stretches all the way down here and actually attaches to the humerus underneath the deltoid and bicep. So let's move that back, smooth that down. And by default, we're already starting to get this little indentation right here called the infraclavicular fossa. It's a little hollow between the deltoid and the pectoralis muscle, which is a nice landmark to get. So I just want to make sure that this muscle is following the angle that it needs to go. This is a great way to sort of study and learn anatomy too, is to build up a figure just using primitives like this. Control, click, and drag twice to execute Dynamesh. Now we can smooth those transitional areas, going with our clay tubes brush, and sort of build these shapes up. Let's get those striations in the pectoralis muscle visible. Let's build up the shapes of the rib cage here. Let's come around here to the back, and I want to make sure that I'm getting the back wall of the armpit. I like it when this is actually kind of visible from the front. It gives a sense of there being a trapezius there, and the muscles coming off the scapula. There's actually a teres major and teres minor coming off the scapula and grabbing the humerus, and it's important to get those. A lot of times people forget how deep the armpit actually should be, and they neglect to put that in there. I'm going to take the clay tubes brush and just stroke along the flank there. That's the lateral oblique. Get a little bit of a tummy here. I like a little pendulous sort of belly there. Bring that up. I'll take my damn standard brush and sort of stroke along that area there. Take the standard brush, and I want to really accentuate the arch of that rib cage. There we go. Take my damn standard brush again. And I think something I tell a lot of my students at Gnomon Online, my online classes, is that it's great to study anatomy and learn as much as you can, but the bare minimum that can get you by is to understand where the origin, the start, and the insertion, the end of a muscle is. The muscle always pulls towards its origin. And then if you just take your damn standard or your clay tubes brush and just sort of stroke in the general direction of the muscle, you can get quite far just with that. A lot of times I think it's almost detrimental to sculpt too much anatomy on the surface, because then it stops feeling like there's flesh over the muscle and bone. It starts to just feel like an anatomy study. So just being able to have that sort of subtlety of stroking just in the direction of the flow of the muscle can be quite handy. So let's go back in with our standard brush, and I'm going to change to alpha 1, and I'm just going to hold down the control key, and I just want to sort of suggest some ribs here. We don't have to draw every single one. I just want to get the suggestion of them in there. And then I'm going to make sure that I push in that armpit, because that rib cage does angle up in here. Take the move brush and pull that out. You'll see why we just did those ribs like that in just a moment. I'm going to smooth that back. Now I'm going to take my clay tubes brush, and I will change to alpha 58. And alpha 58 is great. I love this brush with the clay tubes brush, because if I start in the recess here and then just drag the stroke along those ribs, it starts to create this nice sense of skin stretching over those high points of the ribs. See that? It's just a neat trick I like to use, stroking across a recess. Oops, hit that with smooth. Going with our clay tubes brush, let's fill in that hollow of the infraclavicular fossa there. Smooth that, and then execute Dynamesh. Now our Dynamesh resolution is high enough that it will pick up this detail. I'm going to go back in with my clay tubes brush. Let's change to no alpha, and just make sure that we get that deltoid blocked in there. Take the move brush, and let's tweak our clavicle. The clavicle has sort of 3/3 to it, and it looks like a handlebars. It looks like handlebars off a bicycle. There's the first third right here, which is where the pectoralis muscle attaches, and the sternocleidomastoid. The second third here is sort of on its own. There's really nothing attaching to it on the underside, which is why it creates this nice little hollow there. You'll see that landmark a lot in sculptures. You'll see it in very, very fit people, as well as very, very, very skinny people. And the third third is up here, and that forms this little bony landmark at the center of the deltoid. That's also where the spine of the scapula attaches back here, so we can actually suggest that, since it's a very skinny sort of character. Take our move brush and just adjust these shapes. Let's come around to the back here, and let's build up the traps. I think I called this the trapezius earlier. That's the lats. The traps are up here. So let's bring up the sense of the muscles that are attaching along the spine of the scapula there. Let's extend those up towards the base of the skull. And now we get a much better silhouette here. Turn on perspective, and you're starting to get a very, very interesting character. Now I can do quite a bit of sculpting of detail in Dynamesh mode, and if you prefer doing it that way, you absolutely can. Typically, I don't work that way. I usually do all of my detailing in subdivision mode once I've converted this back into a subdivision model, because again, I consider Dynamesh to be a design tool more than a pure sculpting tool. I use it to establish volumes and shapes. Over here on the back, I want to make sure that the deltoid is attaching along the underside of the spine of the scapula there. Again, just stroke in the general direction of the origin and the insertion of the muscle, and it'll get you pretty far. Take my damn standard brush and just suggest some muscle striations here. But yeah, I prefer converting this to a subdivision model and then going in and adding subdivision levels and detailing. But it's sort of up to your own preference. I recommend you try both to see which one works best for you, and go from there. We're going to actually convert this into a subdivision model in just a moment. Just want to smooth through all of that. Let's come in here and go in with our damn standard brush. Let's add a little navel there. Do a little inflate so it's a little outy. Take a little standard brush there, create a little fold of skin there, and maybe fill out that with the clay tubes brush. I like to take the clay tubes brush and do little circular patterns to create sort of cellulite. It just makes an interesting little surface there. It's something very, very similar I used to do years and years ago with the inflate brush, where I would turn the focal shift up and the draw size down and just create this mild sort of noisy pattern in the skin there where I want it to feel fatty. Take the damn standard brush and let's do a couple little creases just above the pubic bone where that fat layer is. Roll that up over this bony landmark here of the iliac crest. Remember, that's the pelvis right there. Oops, that's too strong because I have this alpha turned on. So let's turn that off. Turn our Z intensity down. Just make sure that we get that. Put a little crease over that landmark so we're getting that muscle flow there. There we go. Now, I want to turn this into a subdivision model to carry on sculpting. To do that, I will go to the Subtool menu. First off, let's save our work. I'm going to close the stroke menu and I'm going to go ahead and save this. By the way, most of the files that I work with through the course of these videos, I do make available in the download file for you. So you should be able to download this as well as other demo files for all the lectures, so you can actually have access to them if you want to follow along or create your own. So with the body selected, I'm going to duplicate that subtool and I'm going to turn on solo, so I'm hiding everybody else. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remesh this with Z Remesher, and then I'm going to project it back onto the high res to get the detail. So watch. I'll go to Geometry, I will turn off Dynamesh and go to Z Remesher. I'll set my target polygon count. 5 is probably okay. We'll have to see. I might want it to be a bit more. Now notice I have X-symmetry turned on. However, I made it a point to make these tentacles asymmetrical. So I need to turn off X-symmetry so the resulting remesh doesn't cancel out all that asymmetry and give me a symmetrical mesh. So let's click Remesh, and ZBrush will start to process the model. If you look at the top of the screen, it says Z-Remesh in progress, and it starts to automate the process of creating a new base mesh based on the volume that I established with the poly count that I requested. Now, 5,000, like I said, we might need a little bit more to accommodate those tentacles, but we'll see. It should complete just any moment now. And here you can see our remesh is complete, and it actually works quite nicely. Now remember, we duplicated the mesh, so here we have the high resolution Dynamesh with all the detail. Here we have the newly remeshed version. So I'm going to turn off visibility on the eyes, because what I'm going to do is divide this mesh and then project it onto the high res to capture all the detail. So this is going to be my subdivision model. I'm going to Control D to add one subdivision level. I'll go to the projection menu here, and I don't need color, so you can turn off color, and I'll just click Project All. I need to make sure that the other subtool is visible. Now I can turn on Solo, and often do, so I just see the detail appear on this mesh. As long as that eyeball is on, it will project onto that mesh, which is why we turn the eyeballs off, because I don't want to project onto the eyeballs. So click Project All, and you'll see it start to capture detail almost immediately. Let's divide again. Click Project All. And let's divide one more time. Watch the detail through here. Project All. And you can see that we're starting to pick up all that detail. If I switch to the Dynamesh and then switch to my projection model, you can see that the two are indistinguishable at this point. So I can select the Dynamesh version here, and I can now delete that subtool. And this is my subdivision model version, which carries all the same detail but has subdivision levels. And because I have subdivision levels now, I can do things like pose it. I can use transpose posing to pose the model. I can give it UVs and extract maps and render it outside of Zbrush where it can be animated. There's any number of things and reasons why you would want to remesh the model. The main one for me being I find it easier to work on a mesh that has subdivision levels because I can continue to step up and down and make changes as required. So for example, on the eyes, I'll mask out the eye area, invert the mask, and then I'll just step down my subdivision levels. And I can take the move brush, and it's much, much easier to move the eyelids when you're just moving a few hundred faces compared to moving thousands or millions of faces. So I can pull these eyelids out a little bit. I can change the shape of the eye. Did not mean to do that asymmetrically, but I actually kind of like the look of that one squinty eye. Bring this down, do a little bit of smoothing there, and then we'll step down and do a little bit of changing of this version, or this side of the eye here. Let's mask out the eye here, invert the mask. Let's step down one more subdivision level, and here we can just make some big changes. Let's change the thickness of the eyelid, make sure that it's thick enough. If you look at the waterline of your eye, your eyelid, you will notice the eyelids tend to be thicker than you might think. They cast a shadow on the eye. They have all sorts of effects that if it's too thin, you're not really going to get accurately. So that's a nice thing to get in there. And then maybe we'll take this lower lid and bring this up just a bit. I'll mask out the upper lid so we don't end up affecting it with our move brush. There we go. Then I can step back up my subdivision levels. So it's much, much easier, I find, to work when you have subdivision levels that you can step up and down in. And I can come back in now and refine the forms. Now, like I say, I consider Dynamesh to be a sketching tool and a design tool. I use it to establish the overall volumes of the character. And once those volumes are in place, then I don't see a reason why I shouldn't bounce it back down into a subdivision model to continue sculpting and then ultimately detailing the model. To me, it's a much more efficient way of working that actually helps you create better form because you're not struggling with millions of polygons at one time. It's perfect for design. It's perfect to get the volumes there, but once you've got them, turn it into a subdivision model. Now, this is how I work when I'm doing design work at work, and very, very, very often they'll come back and say, oh, yeah, well, we got to change to this. We want such and such. This character now has horns, or this character now has extra tentacles coming out of its nipples. You know, there could be any number of changes. And that's simple. You simply Dynamesh your model again by going to Geometry, Dynamesh it again with a resolution high enough to maintain your detail, make your changes, and then repeat the process of bouncing it back down into a subdivision model. So hopefully you found this video helpful. I think this is one of the most fun ways of sculpting in ZBrush because it's the closest analog to me for sculpting in clay. Just taking primitives, mushing them together, and then creating shapes from them and extrapolating a figure. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. In this lesson, we're going to talk about ZRemesher. ZRemesher is an automated remeshing tool that's actually extremely accurate and very, very useful. I've found myself using ZRemesher topology for starting a topology in a film pipeline, and even for some small minor props, I've been able to generate a topology using ZBrush and then utilize that in the pipeline, UVing it and pushing it on through for animation and rendering. So it's come a long way since maybe the first iterations of ZBrush remeshing. They rewrote the entire back end of it in 2019, so it's far more accurate, especially for hard surface. So let's take a look at how we use this. Here I've got a Dynamesh mesh. You can see that it is not at all an ordered topology. How do we get from this to this, which is, if we go into solo mode, an organized mesh that's suitable for animation and UV layout? I've also added subdivision levels to this model. If I step up my subdivision levels, you can see it maintains all the details of this Dynamesh, which only has one subdivision level. This is an organized topology which maintains all the details of my high-resolution sculpture. So how do we do this? Let's take a look. I'm going to go ahead and go back to my Dynamesh, my high resolution model. I'm going to clone this just to get a separate tool. We'll select that from the tool palette so we don't have any other subtools here. I'm going to duplicate this mesh. So I've got two copies of my high resolution Dynamesh, and I'll turn off visibility on the other one. I'll come down here to geometry, and I'll open up I'll turn off Dynamesh and then open up ZRemesher. Now under ZRemesher, you see that we've got ZRemesher and then Legacy 2018. That's actually the previous version of the ZRemesher code. If you turn that on, it will use the legacy version. That is simply for backwards compatibility with older meshes that you might have been working with before the code was updated. Freeze border. Now if you freeze border, what that'll do is it'll take any open holes in the mesh and freeze the number of vertices there and force the retopology to maintain that number of vertices. That's good if you're trying to, for example, remesh a head that needs to attach to a body. So you have a set number of vertices that have to be present. Freeze groups will freeze the border of your polygroups. Keep groups, detect edges, and keep creases. These are all pertinent to hard surface, so we won't be dealing with this on this demo, but we will on the next one. Now, most importantly, we have the target polygon count. I can change this slider, and it's based in thousands of polys. So at 4, it's set to 4,000 polygons. I could use these buttons. I could do adaptive, double the current number, same, or half. Typically, I find it most useful to use the slider itself. Now down here we have adaptive size, and that adapts whether or not non-square quads will be generated. And curve strength generates just how strong your guide curves influence your retopology. So we haven't used guide curves yet, but we will get to that. So in its most simple form, we were just going to set our target polygon count. We'll leave it at 4, and I will click ZRemesher. If you watch at the top of the screen here, it'll show you its progress, and it will start to generate a new topology. What Zbrush does is it looks at the overall shape, and it looks at your target polygon count, and it works out in memory how to get a logical edge flow based on the forms present in the model, maintaining that shape, but also staying within the target polygon count that you give it. That's important. We'll come back to that when we get to guide curves. But suffice to say, it's very, very accurate, a very effective tool. So we'll just have to wait for it to process here, and then it'll come back with a brand new low-res topology. And here it has completed the topology, and you see what's happened is we have a pretty good edge flow, but it's not quite dense enough to support the shapes that I'm trying to get. So I will undo, and I'm going to adjust. I'm going to set my target polygon count to 5. Turn on X symmetry so we get a symmetrical mesh. And let's go ahead and ZRemesh once again. So if you have X symmetry turned off, you will have an asymmetrical mesh. And that's important if your sculpture is actually asymmetrical. This is essentially a symmetrical sculpture. So I'm not too terribly worried about having to turn off my X symmetry. So if I turn on X symmetry, it'll go a bit faster because it will actually compute one side and then mirror it over, and then your topology will fit fine. Most importantly, I've just increased it to 5,000 polygons. Let's ZRemesh it again. And here we have the new topology. You can see that it's quite nice. We get a nice edge flow around the nasolabial folds, the nose. We could do better around the eyes, but we'll address that in a moment when we use guide curves. So as it stands, this is a pretty good ordered topology, especially if we're just trying to get a lower subdivision level, so we can work with subdivision sculpting instead of being stuck just in Dynamesh. So let's take a look now at how we can get all of our detail back into this mesh. So here's my high resolution. That one was hidden. And here's my newly retopologized version. I will add a single subdivision level. Turn on visibility on the high res. I have solo turned on, so we're only seeing one. Go to the subtool menu, go to project, and just click project all. And it says it has polypaint. I don't need to worry about polypaint, so we'll just say no. What will happen is it'll start to project that newly divided subdivision level onto the hidden high res. Let's divide again and project one more time. Now, if we switch between the high res and the low res, you see that they're almost indistinguishable. It's going to be able to use maybe one more subdivision level. Let's go back and project all again. and there we go. Now, there's really no difference between my projected version and my high res. So if we go back to the projected version and press Shift D, we can step down our subdivision levels and then step back up, and you see that we have all of that sculpted detail captured within those subdivision levels and still an organized base mesh. So let's take a look now at how we can further refine our resulting Z remesher. I'm going to delete this subtool, the one that we just remeshed and reprojected, and I'm going to go back to this version here and I will duplicate it. So I've duplicated the high resolution, and now I'm going to go back to geometry, Z remesher, and I'm going to start using something called guide curves. I'm going to turn on my X symmetry, zoom into the eye area here. Now the eye area will give me a better edge loop if I make it very, very clear that there is sort of a line of demarcation there at the lid area. So I'm going to mask out the inside of the lids, just like so. I need a hard plane change there so the ZBrush algorithm can really tell where it needs to place the edge looping. So let's place this mask up through here. And then we will invert the mask, and I'll take my move brush and I'll just push these faces in, grab them up, down, just to make sure that we get a nice hard edge there. There we go. Now, I want to use guide curves to tell ZBrush that I need an edge loop that runs around this eye. So I'll go to B for brush, Z for Z remesher, and I will select Z remesher guides. Now, the Z remesher guides are basically just curves. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to draw a guide curve that runs around the eye, just like so. There we go. We'll draw another one that runs up through this crease, around the eye socket, comes back here and connects. Oops, that one didn't quite work. So let's turn our draw size down so we get more points. It'll be a higher fidelity curve, which simply means it'll be easier for us to draw it on the surface. It's not going to change the resulting topology. So with guide curves, you're just going to draw them like this. You don't have to draw out the entire topology. It doesn't work that way. These are suggestions to the algorithm. So basically, if you've got guide curves, you're telling ZRemesher, look at the total polygon count I've given you. Then, let's set that back to 5. Look at the shape. Do the best you can to get this shape with this polygon count and this edge flow. The first thing ZBrush will throw away are the guide curves. So you may have to adjust your target polygon count to get those accurately represented, or you may have to go in and use polypaint to increase the resolution in that area, which we'll talk about in just a moment. The point is, these guide curves might require some finesse to make them work because it is an automated tool. It's not a manual retopology tool. For that, you would probably want to use the topology brush or some third-party retopology tools where you're actually laying out the specific topology. What's beautiful about ZRemesher is it gives you a very competent, very usable base mesh with a minimal amount of user input and automatically. So let's go ahead and try this now. We've added in our guide curves, set our target polygon count. Now there's curve strength here. I can adjust how much the curves are affecting my remesh. Be careful with this. The higher I set this value, the more it forces those curves to be followed. But it can denigrate the quality of the retopology in other areas because ZBrush is forced to make sure that we get those edge loops. So we'll leave it at 50% for now, and I will just click ZRemesher. You see it starts to process, and let's see what we get. And here's our resulting topology. If we go into frame mode, you see we get a real nice edge flow going around those eyes. Vastly improved just by using the ZRemesher guide curves. Now I'm going to undo this topology, and I want to turn on Use Polypaint. Now, Use Polypaint will allow us to paint color onto the mesh to define how dense or how light the remesh will be in that area. So if we mouse over this, you see that if you set the slider higher, it's going to be red, and lower, it's going to be blue. So make sure my brush Z-add is turned off, and I'm just on RGB. We'll go to the standard brush. Use Polypaint is on. So if I paint in here, we'll just give a nice color to that area. And let's lighten that. We could do that by lightening the color there or lightening the color here. You see we get a finer or a lighter red, so we can transition this area. And now let's turn this very, very far down and go to blue. And we'll paint blue here in the forehead. This isn't going to give us a great topology, but the point of this is to show you exactly what these color values do. So it'll be very apparent when you see this. Let's turn it down even further, and you notice that we get an even stronger blue. Now we will run our remesh again, and this time it's going to look at these color-coded areas and it will adjust the density of faces based on those color codes. So let's Z-remesh. And here's our resulting topology. Let's change the color back to white and go into frame mode. And you can see the areas that were color-coded as red have more topology. The areas lighter red slowly taper off into larger faces, and the areas color-coded blue have very little density. So you can further refine your resulting topology using polypaint to drive what areas get the most density and what areas get the least density. So that's Z-Remesher for organics. Let's take a look at Z-Remesher for hard surface, which is actually quite improved since the previous versions. It was improved in the last version of ZBrush 2019. Here we have a piece that was created using project primitives. It's nice, combination of both hard edges and curvature and transitions between the two types of shapes. So obviously this is not an ordered mesh. This couldn't easily be UV'd, and it's just not pretty to look at. It's not clean. We want to get it to this. Here we have a nice clean retopology which maintains the polygrouping, maintains the hard edges, and gives us a really nice workable mesh. So how can we get from this to this? Well, we use Z-Remesher. Let's select this. I'll duplicate, make sure that that's isolated. I will go to Geometry, go to Z-Remesher. Now this time we're going to use some other settings. I'm going to use Keep Groups. That will keep my polygrouping, and I can smooth the group border with this slider here. I will leave it set to its default value and only adjust it if I have problems along the borders between my polygroups. Now if you have creases, you can turn on Keep Creases. Creases, you'd know if you had them. You either generated them under the Geometry Crease menu, or you generated them in ZModeler if you happen to be using the ZModeler brush to create these shapes. ZModeler we talk about in a separate chapter. It's polymodeling inside of ZBrush, and I highly recommend that you watch that chapter if you've never done it. ZBrush has an amazing set of polygon modeling tools nested within one of the brushes that can be very, very useful. So we don't have creases on this, so I'm going to leave that. We do have edges. Turn on Detect Edges, and that will auto-detect hard edges and then drive the topology based on those. Once again, we have Adaptive Size. I'll leave that at 50%. We don't have any curves, so we won't bother with that as well. We'll leave our target polygon count and then click Z-Remesher. It's going to start processing. You'll see it up here with the status bar at the top of the screen. And it's basically looking at these shapes, doing the exact same thing it did with the organic model, trying to represent the shape that we have in the high resolution, using the target polygon count that we've set to get as close to that shape as possible, and also following the edges between the polygrouping. So let's take a look at this result. And here we go. There is our resulting retopology. So you see that we've got a nice ordered mesh. This is all a single topology. It's maintained the hard edges, and it's quite accurate. We're also keeping our polygrouping as well, which can be really handy if we want to isolate things like this and maybe group loop to cut extra edges around these shapes, or perhaps we just want to be able to quickly isolate and organize the model and continue modeling using these polygroups. I always think it's best to keep polygroups anytime you can, because you're invariably going to find yourself wanting to isolate areas for either painting, UVs, or sculpting. So polygroups are good to hang on to. But this is retopology for hard surface. It's hugely improved since 2019. They have actually rewritten the code from the ground up and added these settings, and it's very, very effective. So that completes our look at Z-Remesher and retopology. Hopefully this has demystified some of these tools for you, and you can see how you can utilize this and start working with Z-Remesher on your own. During the sculpting process, I cannot stress enough how important it is, I think, to leverage the strengths of Dynamesh and subdivision modeling. So if you do utilize your ZRemesher to create a subdivision version of your model, for example here, that maintains all of your details by Z-remeshing and then reprojecting, I think you're going to find that you're able to do much better sculpture, much better form faster. There is an incredible power both in Dynamesh and in subdivision modeling. So if you watch the Quick Start video, watch the Dynamesh video, and watch the Import Mesh video, you'll see sculpting techniques that traverse across each one of those. And I hope that you can see how you can use the strengths of Dynamesh and the strengths of subdivision levels to do the best possible work. And understanding ZRemesher is integral to that. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Now in this video, we're going to talk about how to leverage the strengths of both Dynamesh and subdivision sculpting. Now, you should have already seen the Dynamesh video at this point, and you understand that a Dynamesh mesh does not have subdivision levels. If we switch to our Dynamesh version of this character bust here and go into frame mode, you see it's all very, very tightly clustered quads that have just basically been shrink wrapped in the shape of our character. There is no way to step up and down your subdivision levels, and as a result of that, we can't do things like export this to another application for animation. This is not an animatable topology. We can't easily add UVs and extract texture maps. So Dynamesh works particularly well as a design tool, as a sculpting tool inside of Zbrush. But we always want to be able to return to a subdivision model. That is a version of our character, like this here, which has multiple subdivision levels. As you can see, this is identical to the Dynamesh, but I can step up and down my subdivision levels, going to a lower level. And as you've seen in previous lessons, we want to be able to step down to our lower subdivision levels so we can do things like make big shape changes to the mesh, or most importantly, I think, pose the mesh. So for example, if I were to go to my transpose gizmo here, and then mask out the head, invert that mask, then draw a transpose line right up where the spine would be. Let's position this line, and then turn off our X symmetry. Go to rotate, and I'll just click and drag. Oops, I need to make sure that I don't have a mask on that side of the face. I'll go to the mask lasso, and then let's go ahead and unmask this bit here. There we go. Now I can click and drag the center circle, and I can pose this character. And posing is not something that you can do easily in Dynamesh. It's simply too dense of a mesh to make that possible. So if I were to clear my mask now and then step back up my subdivision levels, I have posed this head. And that's, again, not something that can be done easily in Dynamesh. So there's many, many reasons why we would want to return to our subdivision level model while maintaining all the detail and all the poly paint that we may have done in Dynamesh. So in this video, I'm going to show you the process of how we do this. To begin with, I'm going to go right here under the subtool menu. This is the subdivision version of the model. I'm going to delete it. So now we're back to just our Dynamesh. There are three subtools. There's the head, the eyes, and the teeth. We're going to focus on the head. Of course, the head is Dynameshed. It's 2 million polygons. And what we want to do is we want to copy this model. I'm going to go down here under the subtool palette, and I'm going to click duplicate. And that will make a copy of this mesh. It's right there. It's not currently visible. Now what I want to do is I want to Z-remesh this copy of the model. That's going to basically create a low polygon organized mesh that can be UV'd or animated and exported from ZBrush into Maya or 3D Studio Max or any other program of your choice. So to do that, we're going to go to the Geometry menu. Under Geometry, there's a menu called ZRemesher. In ZRemesher, I have this button here which executes ZRemesh. There's a few other options which we talk about in more depth in the chapter that specifically deals with ZRemesher, but I want to focus in on this particular process of bouncing back and forth between Dynamesh and a subdivision model. So what we need to be concerned with is our target polygon count. I'm going to leave this at 4. This is in multiples of 1,000, so this is 4,000 faces that will represent this head. I could set that a little bit lower, but this is a good kind of median range. It'll give us a nice low resolution representation of the volumes that has a nice edge flow that we can actually utilize. So what I will do is I will press ZRemesher. There will be a status bar up here at the top of the screen while it processes the mesh, and basically ZBrush is automating a retopology. It's looking at the flow of the model, and it's looking at the target polygon count, and it says, all right, I'm going to create a 4,000 polygon mesh that most accurately represents the shape that you've given me. Placing edge loops around smart areas. It understands to edge loop around eyes and mouth. It'll edge loop down here in the hollows in the neck. It's a very, very good tool. And I've actually used it professionally to establish a base topology that I then edit further. There have been times when I've used it to generate a low-res mesh for props, and actually I've been able to use the ZRemesher mesh in a pipeline. So it's a very, very powerful tool, and it's very, very accurate. It was improved greatly in the last version of ZBrush, and that would have been ZBrush 2019. And we'll talk about that more when we talk specifically about ZRemesher. But like I said, this tutorial is just about learning how to take a Dynamesh, turn it back into a subdivision model without losing any of our sculpted form, any of our detail, and without losing polypaint. So when I ZRemesh this model, we will lose our polypaint, but remember we made a copy that still has it. So here if I go into frame mode, you see we've got a nice organized topology. Like I said, it's looped down here into the recesses. Now, I want to make something really clear. This sculpture, if we switch over to our copy that we made, let's turn on solo mode so we're just looking at it. This is asymmetrical. You see that the forms on each side are not perfectly symmetrical. So when I remesh this, it's important that I don't have X symmetry turned on. If you turn on X symmetry, it will symmetrize your low-res mesh. It will make it symmetrical on both sides, and it'll get rid of any asymmetry that you deliberately sculpted in. So that's something important to keep in mind. Now, with this low-res, this is the high-res. That is a Dynamesh that has all the polypaint still on it. That's the copy of our Dynamesh. I'm going to go back to our ZRemesher model. I'm going to go to the bottom of the subtool menu where we've got the project menu. Now I want to project geometry and I want to project color because I don't want to lose that polypaint. I'm going to press Control D. That's the hotkey to add one subdivision level. Once I've added one subdivision level, I'm going to click Project All. Now, I think it's useful to hide the eyes and the teeth so it doesn't project on anything but the head. So we're going to turn on visibility on the other head. Now, I have Solo turned on, so I don't have to see that copy, but it's still there. As long as this eyeball is turned on, this mesh is going to project onto, it's going to shrink wrap itself to that copy of the Dynamesh. So watch what happens. I click Project All, and it says, do you want to project polypainting? And I want to say yes. There we go. So there's my first projection, and it's starting to pick up the color and all the detail. Obviously, it's not as good as my Dynamesh because it's not dense enough. It's only 27,000 faces, so I'll divide it again to make it 108,000 faces. And then once again, I will press Project All, and it will shrink wrap again and pick up more detail and more polypaint. Let's divide another time, going to 433,000 faces and Project All. Since it's a little bit more dense now, ZBrush has to do a bit of thinking. And there we go. So we're getting very close. What I'll do is I'll zoom in a bit, and then I'll just switch between the two heads to see if there's any difference. You see there's probably one more subdivision level worth of projection that we can do. So I will Control D again to add a subdivision level, and I will click Project All. And you should see this polypaint become even more crisp, and you should see the details become more crisp. Let ZBrush think about that. Your status bar is up here at the top of the screen where it shows its progress as it goes through projecting those mesh details and picking up that polypaint. In just a moment here, it should be finished, and you will see this all increase in fidelity. There we go. Now, if we switch between the two heads, there is little to no difference between them. This is a Dynamesh. If we go into frame mode, we can delete that now. We don't need it. So I'll click Delete, click OK. Now this is my ZRemesher mesh. If I press Shift D, I can step down my subdivision levels, and you see that we've actually got a lower subdivision level. If I step back up, we have higher subdivision levels that keep all of our sculpted detail and all of our polypaint. So this is a very, very powerful workflow. This allows you to be constantly bouncing back and forth between Dynamesh and subdivision modeling and back and forth. In my work as a designer, I'm using this constantly because I'll often still be refining the sculpture while a character is moving on down the pipeline. So I may need to bounce back into Dynamesh and make changes to it. If someone gives feedback, for example, I've had many times where a character is changing throughout the process of the film. So it's important that I can take my subdivision model, Dynamesh it again, make changes to it, and then bounce it back into a subdivision model. So let's see how we do that. I'm going to go ahead and Dynamesh this character again. I'm going to go to Geometry. I'm going to open up the Dynamesh menu. Now I am going to Dynamesh it at a high resolution. That's very important. I want to keep all of this detail, so I don't want to be anywhere lower than maybe 500, maybe even up to 1,000. It completely depends on how detailed this mesh is. So we'll leave it at about here, and I will Dynamesh. Now, do I want to freeze subdivision levels? Say no. So let's say that someone has come along, or you've made the decision that you want to make a change to this character. So now I've Dynameshed it. If I go into frame mode, you can see it's in Dynamesh again. We've maintained our detail. Let's say that we need to add some horns on here. I'll turn on X symmetry, and I'll just mask out the area where these horns will go. I'll make sure that my masking brush, I'm holding down the Control key, my masking brush will be set to pen, and I'm just going to mask out that area. Then Control click to invert that mask so it's unmasked there. Now with that area unmasked, I'm just going to go ahead and take the Move brush, pressing the #1 hotkey. If you haven't watched the lesson on creating hotkeys, I recommend that you go ahead and take a look at that now. And let's just go ahead and create some kind of horns on this character. Let's go ahead and adjust these. Smooth this back. I'm just going to erase the mask here, going down the length of the horn so I can smooth this back, and then maybe take the inflate brush, hold down the Alt key, and just narrow that down a bit. Take the Move brush, move those, and then go to B for brush, P for pinch, and I'll select the pinch brush. And I'll just use the pinch brush to pinch down the ends of those horns, smooth that back. Now they've gotten too thin, so I'll go to my inflate brush, inflate those a little bit again, and then clear my mask, and then execute Dynamesh. Now Dynamesh will take a little bit longer because we're working at a very high resolution, that 558, but not too terribly long. So we'll go back to our Move brush, and then we can just finesse this bit. Go to our Clay Tubes brush, turn off the alpha, and we'll dial back the focal shift. Hold down the Alt key and just create a little bit of a few planes in these horns here. I'll go to my Dam Standard brush. We'll create some striations running the length of these horns just to give them a little bit of wear and tear, make them seem like they've got some detail on them. The important thing is that we're just making a big change to the model, and then we can bounce it back into a subdivision mesh shortly. And this is a neat trick that I like to do when I'm doing bone and rock. I'm going to mask out the area of the horn. I'm going to invert the mask so just the horn is unmasked. Make sure that we clean up around the edges here. Now I will go to Geometry. Under the Geometry menu, I'm going to go to Clay Polish. I'm going to turn up Sharp and R Sharp, and I'm going to click the Clay Polish brush. And what that will do is it'll add some nice facets. You can see that that's sort of faceted those horns a bit, made them look quite nice. I'm going to click and drag over to the horn to select a base color for it. I'm going to go to the Standard brush. I'm going to select just the dot alpha, the spray stroke. I'm going to set my spray stroke color slider to 0, and I'm going to turn on RGB on my brush and turn off Z-Add. And what this will do is it'll allow me to paint just color on here. Let's lighten that hue. Put a little bit of a lighter hue up here at the tip. I just want to give it a little bit of variation, that's all. And let's darken it quite a bit. And let's put some darker hues down here at the base of the horn. Just want to add a little bit of poly paint on there so we've got something. I'll go to the drag rectangle stroke. I'll select the vein alpha, and I'll select something a little bit bluish. And just click and drag. Oops, that's too strong. Let's turn our RGB intensity down. I just want to add some veining in those horns. Just add a little bit of color variation there. There we go. Turn up our RGB intensity just a tick, and then add some more veining here at the base. Now I'm going to control click on the background to invert my mask, and I'm going to go to the inflate brush, and I'm just going to inflate around the base of the horn a little bit. And what this is going to do, it's just going to give a little bit of an interface so it feels like that horn is like entering into the head, that there's a point of attachment there where it's coming out of, say, the skull. Let's bring that out a little bit, invert that mask, and we can just tug that horn in. And that should be good. Clear the mask, and then execute Dynamesh. And that should clean that all up. And we've got a nice addition to our character. Now, how do we bounce this back into a subdivision model? Because we do not have any subdivision levels. We can't pose it. We can't do anything in terms of animation or exporting to other programs or creating displacement or texture maps. To do that, we go to the subtool menu. We duplicate our Z tool of the head, turn off visibility on the eyes and teeth, and then turn on solo, so we're only looking at one copy of the model. Go to geometry, go to Z remesher. We'll leave it at 4,000 faces again and just Z remesh the model. And once again, it'll take a little bit of time. We also actually, I believe I've left my X symmetry on for this, so that would be a mistake because that will break this asymmetry that we created in the head here. So when this finishes, you'll be able to see the difference between the low res that we're creating with symmetry turned on and the low res that's created with symmetry turned off. And here we go. Now you can see this is our symmetrical mesh because X symmetry was turned on. And if I go back to the original model, you can actually see where the mesh that's being generated is breaking the asymmetry that we've deliberately created. If you look at areas like, say, in the forehead especially, we've got some asymmetry that we've deliberately put in here that is not really part of this low res. Now you could potentially project this and still pick that up, but it'll be far, far easier if we just undo, turn off our X symmetry, and then run Z remesher again. So we'll go back to Z remesh under geometry, and then Z remesh it with X symmetry turned off. Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be talking about importing meshes into Zbrush. That means bringing an existing topology that's been generated from outside of Zbrush into the program and then sculpting and creating a character based on that model. You may very well find yourself tasked with an instance where someone gives you an existing topology and says, we need you to sculpt the character from this, but don't change the topology. That might be because there's an existing pipeline that this mesh is part of that has UVs, maybe some rigging and animation already applied to it. It's very common that you will find yourself in such a situation where you need to work on an existing model. Now, the purpose of this lesson is to create the character you see on screen right now from this existing topology here. We're going to talk about importing OBJ files into Zbrush. We're going to talk about polygrouping meshes, organizing them so we can more easily work on things like the jaw and the ears. And we're going to also look in depth at sculpting with subdivision levels, and I think that's the most important thing. In ZBrush, you have access to Dynamesh, of course, and if you've watched the Quick Start tutorial or the Dynamesh tutorial, you're already familiar with Dynamesh. Subdivision levels are so important, and in this lesson we're going to focus in just on sculpting a character only using our subdivision levels and not Dynameshing. Once you understand the power of both Dynamesh and subdivision levels, you can leverage the strengths of both and be the most efficient and effective sculptor in ZBrush. So that said, let's go ahead and get started. So to begin with, let's import an OBJ. We do that by going to the Tool menu and clicking Import. That'll bring up the file browser, and I'm just going to bring in a generic male mesh, draw it on the canvas, and go into Edit mode. Now here you see, if I go into Frame mode, we have a simple, basic topology, a human male model. Now, this character has just a single polygroup. That is just the color of the mesh as we see it right now. Polygroups are seen when we turn on frame mode, Shift F, and that's this button here. If I turn off line, I can just look at my polygroups, and if I turn off fill, then I'm going to turn off the color coding. But we don't see any color coding yet because there's only one polygroup. I want to zoom into the head here, and let's isolate the ears and polygroup them. I'll do that by pressing Control Shift, click and drag, and that gives me this visibility marquee. If I press the space bar, I can move it over the ear and then let go, and that starts to isolate just those faces that were within that rectangle. If I press Control Shift, click and drag again, but this time hold down the Alt key, that rectangle becomes red. That will hide everything inside the rectangle. So now I've isolated the two ears. I'll go to Tool, Polygroups, and I will click Group Visible. Now you'll see a new color code has been added to those faces. If I Control Shift click on the background, it'll make all of my polygroups visible again. And you can see there's two polygroups here now. There's the orange one for the ears and the gray one for the body. Now if I Control Shift click on a polygroup, I can isolate it. If I Control Shift click and drag on the background, I can invert that visibility. If I Control Shift click on the background again, here we go, I can make everything visible. So Control Shift click on the polygroup to isolate it, Control Shift click and drag to invert it, Control Shift click on the background to make everything visible. Now if I have a polygroup like this partially hidden, if I go to the visibility menu, I can use things like grow to grow visibility. I can shrink visibility. I can also use outer ring if I want to isolate just the outermost ring of faces there. If I have a portion of the mesh masked, for example, if I have the body masked, and I click Hide Point, it'll hide the unmasked points. Show Point will show everything again. So that's the visibility menu. Now, when I'm viewing polygroups, if we come back down to the polyframe mode, that's Shift F, notice if I turn off line, it takes away the polyframe, and if I turn off fill, it takes away the color. So make sure those are both turned on if you want to see both of those at the same time. So let's isolate that ear again. What I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to sculpt on this ear. Maybe I want to give it a pointed ear, but you notice that my move brush affects the faces underneath it. So I want to be able to easily isolate this polygroup and work on the ear itself. So I'm going to isolate that polygroup and I'm going to click Outer Ring. And that's going to give me the outermost ring of faces around the ear. I'll go to Polygroups and I will click Group Visible. So now I have three polygroups. I have the ear, the ring around the ear, and the face. So I can isolate the ear and mask it. Control click on the background to invert that mask, and now I can easily sculpt on the ear without affecting the other faces. Now let's take a look at how we can do something similar with the mouth. I always organize my meshes like this when I bring them into ZBrush so it's more easy to work with them. If I take my move brush and I want to start opening the mouth, you'll notice that the move brush actually grabs everything underneath that red circle. So perhaps you'll think, well, I'll mask the upper lip. So if I mask the upper lip and then again try and move, you see it doesn't quite work. It still oversprays a bit. Now it is possible to go to the brush menu, go to M for move, and there is a brush called Move Topological. The Move Topological is a move brush that has an auto mask turned on. If I go to Brush, Auto Masking, there's Topological Masking. If I set this range to 0.5, you'll see that I can actually topologically mask the effect of the brush. What that means is, under normal circumstances, the move brush will affect everything underneath the red circle. With topological masking turned on, even though this point is spatially close to this point, Topological masking means it's only going to move points that are close to it on the mesh. So if I wanted to get to this point, I'd have to walk all the way along this edge to get to it. So that means I can move these faces without affecting the lower lip. The problem with this is it's a little slow, and you have to go in there and tweak the range setting quite a bit. It doesn't really suit me and my needs when I want to be sculpting and thinking and sketching quickly. It's very, very good for sculpting things like toes or teeth, objects that are close together that I want to get in nuance. But at the beginning stage of a sculpture, I want to be able to work very, very quickly and organically. So the easiest way I find to do that is this trick. If I go to the Tool menu and go to Morph Target, I'll store a Morph Target. Now you can only store one Morph Target on a mesh at a time. The Morph Target is just a copy of the mesh in memory. So if I make a big change like that and click Switch, I can switch back and forth between my stored version and the Morph Target. So I'm going to delete my Morph Target, store it again, and I'm going to go with the Smooth brush, and I'm going to smooth the mouth open like this. Now I'm going to use that same visibility marquee to isolate the lower jaw. I'm going to hide these faces. Make sure I get right up to the corner of the mouth. Just like so. Let's get those little faces there. There we go. Now I'm going to Control, Shift, click and drag to invert visibility. I will go to the Polygroup menu, and I'm going to click Group Visible. So now I have the lower jaw polygrouped. I can easily isolate it, but you say, Maddie, you've completely lost the shape of the mesh. That's true. So if I go to Morph Target, click Switch, I'll restore the shape of the model, but I still have that polygroup. So I can easily Control, Shift, click on it, Control, click on the background to mask, Control, click on the background again to invert the mask, and then perhaps I can go in with the transpose line and I can start to open the mouth. Or I can go with my move brush and I can open and adjust the lips independently of one another. Far easier, far faster than I could just using Move Topological. So here we've got the head, or the jaw and the ears isolated with some polygrouping. I'm going to show you how you can actually delete portions of a mesh. So for this demo, I only want to work on a bust just because we don't have a lot of time to go through the whole body. But I think it would be nice to show you some sculpting techniques working with subdivision sculpting, because we've talked about Dynamesh. But I think subdivision modeling is a very important thing to understand when it comes to ZBrush sculpting. So I'm going to just do a visibility marquee here to isolate a fair bit of the model. Oops. There we go. So that's a good amount right there. I'm going to hide those faces, and I'm going to go to Geometry, Modify Topology, and I'm going to click the Delete Hidden button. That deletes those hidden faces. Now I'm going to go to my transpose mask. I'm going to press W for move and make sure you turn the gizmo off so we have this transpose line. The transpose line, if I hold down the Control key and then click and drag, it's going to mask based on topology. So I've got a pretty good topology running along the torso here, but I'm just going to help it by creating a masking marquee like this. All I want to do is I want to isolate those arms. I'm going to click and drag to draw a transpose line here, and go to R for rotate. Now if you want to learn more about the transpose tools, watch the video on the gizmo and transpose posing. I'm going to click the outermost circle, and I just want to lower the arms a little bit. I want to rotate these arms back and press W for move, and I'll click the center circle, and I just want to bring the arms out a little bit. I just want to relax the shoulders. Let's clear the mask, bring these points down a little bit, press Shift for smooth, turn my Z intensity down, and let's just do a light smoothing there. That should be good. We could potentially go in, give it one more little rotation. Control, Alt, click and drag will unmask everything within that marquee. And W for move, we can spread the shoulders out a bit. There we go. So it just gives us a nice bust to work with. I don't like to cut the bust off at the neck. I like it to feel very classical. Cut things off sort of at the torso or the shoulders, just so it has a nice visual weight between the torso and the head. So once I've got that, I'm going to go ahead and save this. So I'll go to Tool, Save As, and we'll save this in our documents. Now, of course, if we were tasked with maintaining our existing topology, we would not want to delete faces from it. I'm simply deleting the body for the simplicity of this particular demo and to show you that it is possible to delete faces within ZBrush. Generally speaking, though, if you're bringing in an import mesh, oftentimes you're going to want to maintain all of your topology if it needs to go back out to an existing pipeline. But that said, I just wanted to illustrate for you how to delete faces and how to organize meshes into polygroups. Now, I want to point out that if you are working in Maya or 3D Studio Max or any other 3D modeling application, you can add materials to groups of faces. Let's say, for example, that you've selected faces and added different materials to them. When you import that mesh back into ZBrush, if you export it as an OBJ with those different material selections, if you go to Preferences, Import Export, there is a button here called Import Material as Groups. If you turn that on, any face that has a separate material assignment will be assigned a polygroup. So you can actually set up your polygroups in an external application and then bring it into ZBrush. I find that very, very useful with hard surface, with complex organic characters, or even just trying to set up facial groups in Maya and then import it into ZBrush. I find that very, very helpful. It's also possible to set up polygrouping based on UVs. So if I go back to import, and if we bring in a model that has UVs assigned to it, let's go to our documents and bring in this model. This is a generic female mesh. Now there's no polygroups on here at the moment, but if I go to Z plugin, go to UV master, and let's just click work on clone and flatten, you'll see that this character has UDIMs that extend out through several regions. So if we go back to this character, because I have those UVs set up, those separate UV islands, I can go to polygroup. And there is an option here to polygroup based on UV. So if I do UV group, every UV region gets its own polygroup. Now this can be very, very handy to organize complex meshes or just to create very quickly and easily polygroup tags that I can utilize as I'm sculpting. You may also find that you're just trying to extract a single displacement map for a specific area. So if that area is represented by a single UV, you can easily polygroup by UV, isolate the area, and then delete what you don't need and work on that. I find that very, very helpful when I'm working on inorganic pieces or complex props that have multiple pieces. I can isolate based on UV and then delete the parts that I don't need and then sculpt just on the thing that I need to work on. So that's another way that we can generate our polygrouping. So now let's go ahead and take a look at sculpting. We're going to go back to our creature. So because I did that work on clone, it changed my material. I'm just going to change my material back to the basic material too. And we're ready to start working. So we're going to begin just by selecting the move brush. Make sure that we have X symmetry turned on, and we're just going to do a little bit of sculpting. I'd like to demonstrate sculpting on a low resolution mesh using subdivision sculpting technique rather than Dynamesh. So just to begin with, I'm going to start changing the overall shape. I'll use the control key to mask out the eyes. Let's invert that mask. And let's go to B for brush, M for magnify, select the magnify brush. Maybe let's magnify these eyes a little bit. Go back to our move brush, and I'm going to go to R for rotate. Click and drag to draw a new transpose line here. If you don't have the transpose, make sure you've turned off the gizmo. And I'm just going to rotate the eyes just slightly, just to give them a little bit of a rotation there. Clear my mask and go back to my move brush, and let's just make some big shape changes here. Let's bring the brow forward. Widen that nose a little bit. Let's isolate those ears, and let's scale those ears up. Just using that transpose line again. Oops, that's a bit too big. Let's mask them. Turn on visibility again and invert the mask, and I'm going to use control click on the background to feather the mask. And I'm just going to raise the ears up just a bit, like that. And I'm going to take the move brush, just start to give them a little bit of a different shape. Let's isolate those ears again, mask them, and then invert the mask and go to transpose rotate. I'm going to draw a transpose line straight down the front of the ear, just like this. Make sure I'm in rotate, and if I click and drag in the center circle, I can rotate those ears out a little bit from the head. Go back to our move brush and just continue to adjust the shapes of the eyes here. Adjusting that brow, and let's bring the nasal bone forward a little bit. Let's change our jaw and our muzzle. Now I'm doing a lot of this work, I'm doing all of this work at the lowest subdivision level right now, and I can't stress that enough. I always feel like you should make whatever shape you're trying to make at the lowest subdivision level that can support that form. That's very, very important. You'll notice that a lot of beginner ZBrush models have a certain lumpy quality to them, and that's simply because people are dealing with too many polygons right out of the gate. So while it's possible to divide your mesh up very, very high in ZBrush, and we will obviously do that at some point, you don't want to start that way. You always want to work with as few polygons as possible. That helps you get the best quality form and the best looking shapes. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust the silhouette of the shoulders here. I'm going to go to transpose again. I'm going to hold down the control key, and I'm going to mask down the neck just like this. Control click on the background to invert that mask, and I'm just going to draw a transpose line right up the spine. Snap to a back view, and let's move that line so it actually is where the spine would be. Turn off X symmetry and go to rotate. I'm going to click the outermost circle here and rotate that neck forward. Go to W for move and click the center circle and just bring it forward a bit. Now let's mask up to the base of the skull. Go to transpose rotate, and we'll draw one from about beneath the ear. That's close to the pivot point of the head. And let's bring that forward. And that just gives us a different kind of posture in this character. Let's turn our X symmetry back on, and we can just hunch these shoulders a little bit. And let's play around with the shapes of this nose. Zoom in. Make sure that everything maintains its dimensionality. We want to make sure that nothing is sort of flattened out or occurring along a flat plane on the face, because the face has dimension to it. It's happening around, cylindrical and spherical forms. So I think I might want to elongate the face a little bit. So I'm going to mask out the lower face. I invert the mask, just take the move brush, and I can just sort of stretch this down and out a little bit. Let's isolate that lower jaw and give it a mask. Maybe give it a little bit of an underbite. Again, we still haven't added any subdivision levels. This is entirely on subdivision level 1. We can get so much out of that single subdivision level. I take my move brush and just tweak this silhouette in a little bit here. Now you'll notice here that my symmetry has gone off. If you do lose symmetry, and we do have an entire video on restoring symmetry, but I'll cover this very, very quickly here. I'll turn off X symmetry, and I will control, click, and drag. I'll mask one side of the mesh. That's the mesh side that I want to keep. So let's keep this one over here, which doesn't have the kink in the edge. So I'm going to mask the side I want to keep. I'll go to Deformation, click Smart Resim, and that'll resymmetrize the mesh, so it's the same on both sides now. Turn my X symmetry back on, and I can continue to work. Let's go to the top view here, and I just want to bring out the cranial mass. Let's take the move brush, bring that forward, bring these nostrils out a little bit. We really don't have a lot to work with for the nose, but we just want to get the most basic sort of shapes in here. Now we're about ready to add a subdivision level, so I'll press Ctrl D. That adds a new subdivision level, and we can continue working from here. I may at this point switch to the Clay Tubes brush, turning off my alpha. I use the Clay Tubes brush with no alpha far more often than I do use the alpha. So I use this to continue to refine the underlying skeletal anatomy of the skull, the temporal ridge here. Very, very important to establish the cheekbones early on, as well as the angle of the mandible or the jaw. So I'm going to get that locked in there. Take the damn standard brush, just do a little bit of creasing up in here, just to get a nice depth in that eye socket. Take the move brush, and I just want to pull those faces along that eyelid down. We're going to add a subtool for eyeballs here in just a moment, so we've got something to actually sculpt around, and it really helps sort of connect to the character once you've got an eyeball in there. It gives you a sense of purpose and a sense of presence once there's eyes in there, and I find it a lot easier to sculpt once I've got something like that in place. Let's pull those corners of the mouth down. Maybe pull them back a little bit. So let's go ahead and add those eyeballs in there. I'll do that by going to the light box, go to the tool menu, and I'll just double click a polysphere. Now again, that appears to replace my character, but the character's still here. The polysphere is now loaded into the tool menu. So I'll go to Subtool, Append, and I'll append that polysphere in. Now that comes up here. I'm going to select it by alt-clicking on it, or you can click here in the Subtool menu to select it. I'll press W for Move, and this time I will turn the gizmo on. You see the gizmo is far down here. I'm going to unlock the gizmo and click this, go to Unmasked Mesh Center, and then lock it again. That'll center the pivot. I can scale this down now, and I can place it in the eyeball, or in the eye socket. There we go. And then I'll go to Z Plugin, Subtool Master, Mirror, into one subtool across the X-axis. Click OK, and that should give me a subtool for 2 eyeballs. So now I can go back to the head, and it'll be a lot easier now to shape those eyelids because we have a sphere to actually work with. So let's go ahead and shift these around. I'm going to pull the medial canthus away from the surface of the eyeball there. Scooch these up. Let's mask the lower lid so we can really affect the corner there. This can be a tricky area to sculpt because we need to get a little crease there. So already at this number 1 subdivision level, I'm already thinking about that crease. I'll invert that mask and tuck these edges up under. Now it looks very rough right now, but as soon as we add subdivision levels, it'll really start to come into its own, and you'll start to see that form. And it'll be far nicer because we started it at a lower subdivision level than it would be if we tried to sculpt it while we have like a million polygons. So let's just think about some of the forms of the face here. Get the fatty tissues of the cheeks, the nasolabial fold. I'm already thinking about the nasolabial fold. Again, make shapes at the lowest possible subdivision level that will support the shape you're trying to make. It might be a little difficult to get that sort of idea across to you at the very outset, but you'll get it. And once you start doing it, your work will improve vastly because you're not going to be fighting against that lumpy look as often as you would if you didn't take into account how much you can do at a lower subdivision. And this methodology is why I prefer sculpting with subdivision levels to sculpting in Dynamesh. I'll start meshes in Dynamesh, but I'll leave Dynamesh mode quite soon because I think once you've established your volumes, there's really no need to stay in Dynamesh mode. It's perfectly fine to go ahead and convert into a subdivision model and then start working with subdivisions after you've started it with Dynamesh. I'll bounce back and forth between the two tool sets. I'm going to move down here to the neck and start thinking about clavicles. Don't quite have enough geometry to get those in there, but I'm still going to start suggesting them. Pectoralis muscles. And Control D to add a subdivision level. And you see that that already improves the look of those sternomastoid muscles because we created them down here at the lowest possible subdivision level that could handle them. Let's sketch in some clavicles here. Don't worry if they're a little overstated because we are going to add a subdivision level and that will naturally sort of scale them back a little bit. And of course we can smooth as we work. Start to build up that deltoid a little bit. And put our spine of the scapula in here, border the scapula. Turn down the Z intensity on our smooth brush and just do a little bit of smoothing to this area. Go back to our move brush and just make some adjustments here to the mouth. Get a tubes brush and let's tinker around with the nose here. Take the move brush and we'll just make some changes to the shape of the nose. It is a sketch, so these things can continue to sort of develop as you work. If you don't like the nose right away, you can continue tweaking those shapes and find something that you like. I think it's important not to get stuck on any one particular area for too long. If you find yourself sort of overworking an area, step away from it for a bit. Move on to something else and then come back to it. It will make itself known. It will resolve itself as you keep working on it. But if you're not making progress, move on to something else. I'm always trying to move around the model as I'm working. I try not to ever stay in one area too long because then you just overwork that one particular area. So I'll step back down to my lowest subdivision level, and I just want to make some big shape changes to the mesh down here at level 1. Always make your big shape changes on the lowest subdivision level, and then step back up, and anything you change at the low level will telegraph back up to the higher levels as well. So we'll just change the angle of the jawline. We've used a mask to isolate that. And we want to use our polygroups to adjust the ear, so Control-Shift-Click on the ear, polygroup. Control-Click on the background to mask it. Control-Shift-Click on the background to view everything again, and then Control-Click to invert the mask. And then we'll use the move brush to change that ear shape around without affecting the rest of the body. Now I want to rotate the ear slightly, so I'll go to R for rotate, and that brings up the gizmo. If I hold down the Alt key and then click on one of the corners, I can move the pivot to about there, and then I'm just going to move that out and rotate it back. Go back to my move brush and just adjust those shapes. Now I want to change the shape of the eye, so I'm going to mask the eye area, invert that mask, take my move brush and just turn it up pretty large, and I'm just going to spread the eye area out a little bit. Take my move brush and just enlarge the eyes. Alt-click on the polysphere that we've got for the eyeballs. That selects that, and I'll just go back to W for move. Now you'll see the gizmo for move is actually way down here, and I want to center it. So I'm going to turn off X symmetry, unlock the gizmo, reset it, and then click Go to Unmasked Mesh Center. Now we'll lock the gizmo again, and then we can move those spheres out. Now Alt-click on the head to select that Z tool. And with my move brush, I'm just going to adjust those shapes around the eyes. So as I do this, just if I go to Shift F, I can view my polyframe, just to make sure that I'm keeping the topology pretty consistent, keeping the edge flow accurate around the eye, so we're not sort of destroying that ordered mesh too much. We want to make sure that we still maintain all the edge flow and topology, so the eye area will still deform accurately when eventually this is animated. I'm going to step up a subdivision level with the D hotkey. And just do a little bit of tweaks to the nose here. Let's bring that muzzle forward a little bit. And just adjust the shape of the mouth. And again, I'll take the move brush and just adjust the cheekbone. Always trying to be very careful to maintain a sense of there being skeletal and muscular anatomy underneath that motivates all the shapes that I'm making. And we'll adjust the brow area here. Once again, mask the eye area. I just want to adjust this brow. making sure that we don't impact the soft tissues around the eye. I just want to work on the sort of the frown lines and the furrowing of the brow here. I'm going to go to the standard brush, using my hotkeys to select brushes, by the way. If you haven't watched it yet, be sure to watch the video on hotkeys, because I think it's very important as you're sculpting to utilize the hotkeys for your brush selections. It's far, far easier than just B for brush, S for standard, and then T to select the standard brush. Having your own custom hotkeys, I think, makes all the difference in your speed and efficiency while you're working. Just using the damn standard brush here to add a couple sort of indentations, creases. Again, at a very low subdivision level. I'll step up one more subdivision level now and start to continue to refine these shapes. If I hold down the Alt key while I'm using the damn standard brush, it gives a nice pinch. I find that pretty useful for doing things like the lips. We'll turn off frame mode with Shift F. And I'm going to go to the inflate brush and just do a little bit of inflating around the mouth area here. I just want to sort of pucker these shapes to give a sense of sort of gravity and weight here. I'm going to mask this jowl right here, this little bit of sagging skin. Invert that mask, and I'll take the inflate brush and just run it along the lower edge, and that just helps sag that piece down a little bit. Take the move brush and just give it a little bit of kind of a teardrop shape, so it feels like that's maybe heavy skin sort of sagging right there, so it feels quite like a jowl. Go back to frame mode, Shift F, step down my subdivision levels, and I want to do a little bit of maintenance here on the eyelids. I just want to pull this topology out a little bit more. See where the eyelid topology is sort of turning inside out here just a little bit. I'm just going to turn my draw size down so I can just grab individual points very easily. And let's just make sure that these are sitting exactly where I want them to. I'm just going to conform these up against the eyeball itself. Bring these down. Make sure that we get the thickness of the eyelid there. Step up with the D hotkey. That brings us up one subdivision level. Here we go. Conform that back against the surface of the eyelid, or eyeball, I mean to say. I'll take the inflate brush now and just do a little bit of an inflate, just to give some nice thickness to the eyelids. A lot of times people neglect to realize just how thick the eyelid can actually be, and that can look very strange if you don't get that in there. So let's go ahead and get a little bit of a crease here and here, step up our subdivision levels, and we can already see what we're getting. Let's take our clay tubes brush. I'm just going to run that clay tubes brush along the edge of the eye here and get that eyelid extending, that crease in the outer eyelid. Take our move brush and just do a little bit of tweaks to this shape here. Now I'm going to mask out the eye bag, invert the mask, and again I'll take my move brush and I just want to tug that eye bag down. Take the inflate brush and I'm going to control click on the mask, and if you can control click on the masked area, it will feather that mask. I want to erase the mask here a little bit, so I press Control and Alt together, and that allows me to feather that mask. And then I'll take the inflate brush and I'm just going to inflate that corner, that eye bag there, so it sort of puckers over the cheekbone next to it. Control click on the background and that will invert that mask, and I'm going to inflate the shapes that are just next to it as well, just to give it a little bit of a sense of compression there. Turn off frame mode, and there we go. I'm going to widen the nostrils a little bit. Bring the clay tubes brush here, and let's change up the shape of this nose a little bit more. Take the move brush. Just want to adjust the shapes of those nostrils a little bit more. Build out the shape, the tip of the nose. That's called the alar cartilage. That's the very, very tip of the nose. I just want to give it a very distinctive shape there. And I'll take my standard brush, hold down the Alt key, and create the philtrum. Sometimes it's called the Cupid's bow. It's that little indentation just between the bottom of the nose and the upper lip. And then using the damn standard brush, just do a little bit of a suggestion of the upper lip shape here. And with my damn standard brush, I'm going to go in and add a couple more creases along the lower eyelid and along the upper eyelid. So you might notice right here that the orientation of the mesh when it came in is not actually sitting. So we're looking down the Z axis. So if you find something like this, now it may have come in flipped because of the orientation in the originating program, or it may just be that your mesh is upside down and you need to correct it. So if you find yourself in a situation like this, here's how we can rotate the entire character, including the eyeballs, to match it to the correct orientation. I'll go to R for rotate, unlock my gizmo, and go to Unmask Mesh Center, and then reset the gizmo, lock it again. Now click this rectangle here, and that gives me the pizza box stack. Sometimes Pixelogic calls it the pizza boxes. This creates a transpose stack, so every subtool will now be transposed. I'll hold down the Shift key, and I'm just going to click and drag, and you can see the number readout right down here. It gives me the number of degrees that are being changed. So I'm just going to rotate it around until I get to 180. And there we go. So now we've corrected the orientation of the character. If you want to learn more about Gizmo, there's also a video that specifically just talks about Gizmo and transpose. So I recommend that you take a look at that as well if you have not already. I'm just going to fill out the trachea and the underside of the chin here. Now I want to change the scale of the body in comparison to the head. So I'm going to step down my subdivision levels. I'm going to mask out the head. Anytime the head is larger than the body, something starts to look rather childlike or adolescent. So what I want to do here is I want to actually scale the body so it's a bit larger than the head. So I've moved my gizmo there, and I need to untick the pizza boxes, and then click and drag. And then we can adjust that scale of the head to the body. There we go. So now we get a bit of a better proportion there. Just smooth that transition. And I'll select the magnify brush. Turn my Z intensity down quite low on that and just do a little bit of magnify here at the jawline, at the trapezius muscles, the deltoid muscles. I'm going to make sure that I look at the model from underneath, and I'm going to adjust things like the shape of the mouth, make sure that it really is conforming around a cylindrical form here. We don't want any of our facial features to become too flat, which there's a danger of that as you're working. Things can become flattened if you're working from the front view for too long. So let's just adjust that. Let's bring the cheekbones forward just a bit, and maybe widen that jawline just a bit. I'm going to step up my subdivision levels and go to the clay tubes brush and just fill out the temporal fold, or the temporal fossa here, the hollow at the sides of the skull, just to give it a sense of there being a temporalis muscle in there. That's one of the muscles that helps open and close the jaw. If you clench your jaw and put your fingertips there at your temples, sometimes where you might feel that you have a headache, that's your temporalis muscle. I'm going to use the move brush just to spread out the shape of this frontal eminence. That's the sort of the mound at the front of the skull there. I'm going to turn off X symmetry, go in with my damn standard brush, and add some asymmetrical detailing to the brow furrow here. step up another subdivision level. Now we don't have another subdivision level at this point. If I go to the geometry menu, you see that we're actually at our top subdivision level. So I'm going to press Control D, and that adds a new subdivision level and gives us more geometry to play with and detail with. So this allows us to go in here and start to create a bit more shapes. Go into with Clay Tubes brush, I'm just going to fill out that recess a little bit. The Clay Tubes brush I really do like because it does tend to fill into the recessed areas first, which is really nice when you're trying to like sculpt into like a furrow or sculpt into a wrinkle that's perhaps gone too deep, which is possible. It's possible to make wrinkles too deep. You can just fill them out ever so slightly just using the Clay Tubes brush. I'm going to use the inflate brush to sort of pucker those shapes there. Go to my damn standard brush and put some creasing here. Oops, that's too much. Let's step down our subdivision levels. And I'm going to mask the brow here. And I just want to adjust the length of the nasal bone. Go to the move brush, turn on X symmetry. I'm just going to bring that nose down a little bit. Feather that mask, bring the brow out. There we go. Step back up our subdivision levels. Turn off X symmetry, and with the damn standard brush, I'm just going to add some creasing here. There we go. And while I'm at it, I'm going to start putting some asymmetrical kind of folds coming up out of the mouth. Smooth those back a little bit with the smooth brush. Go with the Clay Tubes brush, and I can sort of fill that in just a bit. Go back in with damn standard, and let's create a few more details there. Turn on our X symmetry. With my Clay Tubes brush, I'm just going to accentuate those cheekbones. And I really want to maintain this sense here of the lower border of the ocular orbit or the eye socket. Because I always really like sculpting this particular area because I like getting that sense of a bony kind of region in the cheekbone butting up against this softer region here at the nasolabial fold. So with the Clay Tubes brush selected, I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and that will help me create kind of a little plane. And whenever you're sculpting organics, I think it's very important to keep an idea of your planar layout, because all shapes sculpturally can be broken down into planar analysis. If you do a Google search for planar analysis human head, you'll find a whole bunch of different illustrations of a head broken down into simple planes. And it's a really great sort of learning tool when you're trying to learn to sculpt, is to examine how the planes of the face relate to one another. And as I sculpt, I'm often thinking about that, and I'm actually using the Clay Tubes brush to create those planes. So here I'll take the Clay Tubes brush and I'll create a plane for the side of the masseter muscle and for the jaw here. Just thinking about this in terms of planar analysis. So you will sculpt those planes, but you don't necessarily keep them. You will smooth them back, but it's still, if you begin your sculpture thinking about the planar analysis and then smooth them away, you will end up maintaining that kind of structural integrity. It will carry through, and your sculpture will benefit from it. I'm going to take the move brush and just adjust this brow a little bit. Take that Clay Tubes brush and I just want to continue out the side of that ocular orbit. We'll come down here and revisit our clavicles. Take the standard brush, hold down the Alt key, and I'm just going to create a little hollow here between the deltoid muscle and the pectoralis muscles. The name for this is called the infraclavicular fossa. It's a nice little landmark. You'll see it a lot on very, very fit people or very, very skinny people. It's just the hollow in between those two muscle groups, the deltoid and where the pectoralis muscle tips in underneath the deltoid and grabs onto the humerus bone. Build out the sternum here. Working very, very quickly and gesturally. Don't worry about being super accurate and super, focused in on one area. Sculpt quickly and smooth, move around, and return to things. You don't have to make every shape perfect on the first go. And that might be a strange thing to sort of internalize if you're new to sculpting and new to ZBrush, but don't try and make everything perfect in the first go. You can come back to it, and I think it's more of a waste of time, and it's harder if you just find yourself like struggling over one area for ages, rather than moving around, moving on to the next one. Just sketch the lines in, get the shapes in there. So I'm putting in the borders of the scapula, and then I'm moving away from it. I'll come back to it. Hitting it with a little bit of smooth. Take my damn standard brush, and I'm just going to, oops, that's too strong. Let's turn down our Z intensity. I'm going to work around the shape of the sternocleidomastoid. Take my standard brush, push in a little bit of a hollow there, and then let's pull out these ropey kind of tendons. These are called the platysma. I just wanted to suggest those there. Take my clay tubes brush, and let's fill out this hollow here. This is where the trapezius muscles are grabbing onto the back of the skull, as well as the various erector scapulae or levator scapulae muscles and everything that's underneath that that trapezius muscle, which is actually quite a thin sheet of muscle. Really what gives it most of its shape are the muscles underneath it. So we just want to build that up a bit. Take my move brush, and I'm just going to adjust that shape there. Smooth it back. I'm just going to step down my subdivision level, take my shift smooth brush, turn the Z intensity down, and I'm just going to smooth this whole area down here at the lowest subdivision level, and then step back up. And you see, this is a nice technique because it maintains those shapes, but it makes them a lot more subtle. So I find that to be a really, really useful thing to do as I'm working on an area. If I just want to make it a little bit more subtle, I will do that. I will step down to a lower subdivision level and do a very, very light smoothing on it, and then step back up. Let's take my move brush, and let's adjust these clavicles. Clay tubes brush, and let's adjust the deltoid here. Take the damn standard brush. And get the striations of that pectoralis muscle and the deltoid muscle. These can be overstated right now. They don't have to be exact. We can, again, smooth things back a bit as we go on. Let's fill in that infraclavicular fossa a little bit so it's not quite so profound. Do a little bit of smoothing to this whole area here, and then step back up. And you see it makes that all a bit more subtle. You can just accentuate, catch a little bit of shadow here, smooth that back. I'm going to use my damn standard brush and create a couple little wrinkles over the ear here. And anytime I sculpt a wrinkle, I always try and go back and do an additive stroke along with it. So I'll cut a crease in using the damn standard brush, and then I'll come in and very, very gently take the standard brush and add a little bit of volume to it. So all the wrinkles don't have to just be negative spaces that are cut into the mesh. We do have a little bit of volume where the skin is puckering or being compressed in the wrinkle. Build out that cheekbone a little bit. Now let's take a look at the ears. I'm going to step down my subdivision levels and go into frame mode. And just do a little bit of tweaking here with the move brush. I'm just going to bring that polygroup, that blue polygroup over a little bit. Do a little bit of smoothing to even all of that out. Go back to my move brush and just tweak this shape a bit. Now with the ear, there's three parts of the ear that we want to be concerned with. There is the helix, which is the outermost border of the ear. There's the antihelix, which is the little Y-shaped bit that sits inside. And then the tragus. And then there's smaller bits and pieces which are quite important to get the shape, but those are kind of the three main forms. the tragus and the ear lobe, of course. So what I'll do is I'll take the inflate brush and I'm just going to inflate the outermost border of the ear, that being the helix. I'm going to isolate the ear so I don't end up adjusting something on the head itself when I really just want to be working on the earlobe. So let's get this shape in there. Take the damn standard brush and just get the border of that really established. Take the inflate brush, make sure that we've got enough volume here to work with. Now I'm going to take my standard brush and I'm going to push in the whole of the ear here. That's called the conch of the ear. And I'm going to basically go around the underside of the helix and just really accentuate that shape. So the helix of the ear comes around like this and it has a little leg that dips inside right there. If you look at your ear in the mirror, you'll see this. That's just called the leg of the helix. That just dips right down there inside the ear and just helps it give the ear that shape that you'll recognize. Now right here we're going to have the tragus. The tragus is a little pointy out bit of skin that if you were to sort of plug your ears with your fingers, it might be the piece that you push inside your ear. It sort of helps protect the ear hole. So we're just going to scooch that out a little bit. So we've got that visible. Take the inflate brush and just give it some volume. And I'll take the move brush and just tug this little shape down here. There we go. So now what we want to do is we want to think about the anti-helix. That's the Y-shaped bit right here that we were talking about. Now I'm going to mask that, invert the mask, and I'm just going to take the clay tubes brush and sort of build that shape up. Let's turn off frame mode so it's actually a bit easier to see what we're doing. Just want to build that up. Take the standard brush, create the little Y shape here. Let's go ahead and push this in. Smooth it back. Do a little bit of masking around the helix here. Invert that mask. Take the move brush and we'll just pull the helix over the anti-helix a little bit. Do some smoothing there. Invert that mask and I'll pull the anti-helix up under the helix, and that just helps create a little crease there, a real sense of delineation between those two shapes. Now, the shape of this ear is a little different because it's a pointed ear, but we're really following the standards of the human ear. I think whenever you're trying to do fantasy anatomy, you should always try and fall back on actual human anatomy as much as possible. It just gives the viewer something to hold on to. They may not understand human anatomy in terms of naming things and understanding their structure, but they still will recognize the shapes. And when they see shapes that they recognize, they'll say, oh, that looks real. So let's take our standard brush, build out that Y shape a little bit. There we go. Let's come around to the back. There we go. Getting a nice kind of goblin-y creature ear here. Let's inflate this, isolate it again with our polygrip. Take the move brush and let's just adjust the shape of the earlobe here. Take the inflate brush, inflate it out. There we go. That gives us a nice ear here. I'm going to go to the move brush and I'm going to go to brush, curve, and I'm going to turn on accurate curve mode. And that just makes the move brush give me a much sharper point. I use this a lot when I'm trying to make spines or spikes or points. It's a really nice little brush tweak that's not necessarily very well known. It's well hidden there in the interface, and a lot of people don't realize that it's there, but I find it very, very useful in my own work. I'm going to go to the damn standard brush, and again I want to just do a little crease along the front of the ear here. Smooth that back. Take the standard brush, and let's just let those wrinkles flow out like that. There we go. Cool, now I'm going to go ahead and save my work. And now we're going to go ahead and add another subdivision level so we can put a little bit more detail into the character. use my damn standard brush to sort of catch shadow, areas around the muscles, and any bony landmarks. I just want to just subtly and accentuate those. Stepping down our subdivision levels, and then use the move brush again to make big shape changes. Just want to tweak the shape of the head, the cranial mass, the occipital, the shape of the ear. We'll just tweak that using the move brush down here at level 1. And I just want to tweak the shape of the eyelids here. Make sure that we get that characteristic arc right there. It's more extreme, closer to the inner corner of the eye, and the lower eyelid, it's the opposite. It's on the outer corner. So I want to make sure that we get those in there. Then we'll step back up our subdivision levels, turn off X symmetry, and then just going in with the damn standard brush, just tweaking around the shapes of the nose here. And just creating some radiating folds, or wrinkles, I should say, coming out of the mouth. And I want to get these shapes on either side of the mouth, the lower lip here. That's the bottom of the orbicularis oris muscle. Take my clay tubes brush and let's step down a couple subdivision levels and build those up. Smooth that back, and then step back up our subdivisions. Smooth that a little bit, and then turn off X symmetry, and we'll go back in now and play around with some of the wrinkles and shapes here. Again, don't be afraid to just be sketchy. Like, treat it like you might treat sketching with a pencil, and just work quickly and very gesturally around the shapes and come back to them. I'm going to step down, turn on X symmetry, and using my clay tubes brush here to adjust that lower lip shape a little bit. Fill in that hollow there and smooth it. Take the standard brush, play around with the shape of that lower lip, and I think I'm actually going to make that lower lip bigger. So I'm going to isolate the lower jaw. I'm going to take the move brush, and I'm going to pull the shapes of that lower lip down. Because the upper lip is quite thin, I think I'd like some contrast here and make the lower lip quite thick by comparison. Smooth that a bit, take the inflate brush and give it a little bit of an inflate. Let's mask that and then invert the mask, and we'll take the move brush and we can kind of adjust the other shapes there to match. Step back up our subdivision levels, go in with our damn standard brush, get the crease, the ledge of the lower lip. Let's see that little line of demarcation there between the soft fleshiness, the pillar of the lip, and the edge of the muscle, the orbicularis oris muscle. You often see that represented at the lower border of the mouth there. There we go. Let's create just a little archaic smile there, not too much. Smooth that area back. Hit it with a clay tubes brush. Oops, that's too much. Let's turn down the Z intensity on our clay tubes brush. There we go. I'm going to take the standard brush, get a little bit of a cleft in the chin there. Smooth that back and then fill it out slightly with the clay tubes brush. Damn standard brush. Again, thinking about the creases here, and we're going to turn off X symmetry for this. We don't want these wrinkles and these shapes around the mouth to be too symmetrical. That would really call attention to itself. Take my standard brush, turn on X symmetry again, and I want to adjust the shapes of the nose. Step down my subdivision level. So you see, this is something that I really want you to like take away from this particular lesson is when we're working with subdivision levels as opposed to working with Dynamesh, just how often we're moving between subdivisions, how often we're stepping up and down, because it's a really important thing, I think, to be able to do, is to move up your subdivision levels to add detail, and then move down your subdivision levels to add or to adjust form. And of course, when we're using Dynamesh, we don't have that luxury. Dynamesh just gives you a single subdivision level. Now, if you watch the tutorial on Dynamesh, or watch the Quick Start tutorial, which utilizes Dynamesh, you'll see that, Dynamesh is incredibly powerful. If you watch the dedicated Dynamesh, our tutorial for converting Dynamesh to subdivision, you can see that we can actually leverage the strengths of both techniques. And I think that's a really important thing to understand how to do, because while Dynamesh is very, very powerful, this ability to step down and just make big overarching changes like this to the shape is integral to actually just doing good form, doing an effective sculpture in Zbrush. And I think a lot of people don't get that at the beginning of their Zbrush journey. They don't learn that lesson quite yet. And that makes it harder, I think, to do the best possible work, because they'll be struggling often against the millions and millions of polygons that they're dealing with in Dynamesh, and never quite getting the strength and the importance of being able to step down your subdivisions. I just want to flare those nostrils up a little bit, and then step up our subdivision levels. Let's take our damn standard again. There we go. I'm going to isolate the upper lip, and I'm going to mask out the upper lip right up to that sharp edge. What I want to do is I want to create this sort of soft fleshiness of the upper lip, just like we have on the lower lip. I'll step down my subdivision levels for that, and I'll use the inflate brush just to inflate this a little bit. Smooth it, inflate it again. I just want to get a real sense of the volume of the upper lip. Let's invert that mask and just do a tiny bit of inflating along that border. Step back up our subdivision levels, and we'll take our damn standard brush, turn off the X symmetry, and I'm just going to just suggest some of the wrinkling in the upper lip. There we go. Clear the mask. Oops, there we go. Now let's do the same for the lower. I'll isolate the lower lip. Let's mask it out. Make sure that we turn on our X symmetry. Roll around to the inside of the mouth here. Invert that mask. Step down a couple subdivision levels. And we did get already some nice volume here in the lower lip. So I'm just going to go to the inside of the lip here and just make sure that it's got volume on the inside as well, so it doesn't just sort of flatten out there. Step up to our highest subdivision level. Take the damn standard brush. Turn off my X symmetry and just... So in a situation like this, this is kind of interesting. I'm trying to run a stroke back and forth along here. This is a nice trick. If you lock the camera, you're not going to actually rotate it if you click and drag on the background. So this allows me to start my stroke actually off the model. There we go. Let's unlock the camera, move it over. Lock it again. It just makes it easier when I'm trying to make these strokes where it doesn't try and move the model anytime I step or anytime I accidentally click somewhere that's not on the mesh itself. There we go. Let's take the inflate brush. Now for the inflate brush, I'm going to turn the brush up, turn the focal shift up, and turn my Z intensity down. And this has a real interesting kind of puckering effect as well. It's very, very subtle because I've got the Z intensity turned down quite low, but it's something I recommend that you try because it inflates in a... Oops. Thought that didn't look right. I'm not on the inflate brush. There we go. Select the inflate brush, turn the draw size up, and turn the focal shift down, and my Z intensity down. And that should... There we go. It inflates in more of a flattened kind of plateau. Let's invert that mask. Do the same down here. I'm going to take the clay tubes brush, and I just want to make that crease underneath the chin, or underneath the lip above the chin, a little bit more shallow. Smooth that back, and then reveal all. I'm going to isolate the upper lip with a mask. Take the move brush, turn on my X symmetry, and just want to adjust the shapes of that. Always remember that you can move around and look at things from other perspectives than just straight on. Let's invert that mask. Let's isolate the lower lip. Maybe pull that one down a little bit. Step down our subdivision levels for that. Let's pull that down just slightly. Invert the mask. And let's see what happens if we pull that upper lip forward just a little bit. We're starting to get rid of that underbite that we created. No, I don't like that. I kind of like the underbite, so we're going to keep it. So let's invert that and just bring this down. I just want to really make it feel like those lips are interacting. There we go. Step back up our subdivision levels. Go back to my damn standard brush. There we go. Clear the mask. Turn my X symmetry back on, and I'm used to using the damn standard brush with the Alt key to create sort of a bit of a plane there on the nostrils. Go in with the standard brush, fill out the body of that a little bit. Go with the clay tubes brush, build up that sort of nasolabial compression there. I'm going to step down my subdivision levels and I'm going to mask out the nose. I'm going to mask this whole area out right here. And I'm going to take the move brush and I just want to adjust the fat of the nasolabial fold here where it's running up against the nostril, where the nasal furrow, as it were, is actually displacing or pushing that skin up. Go to the inflate brush. Let's inflate that. Clear the mask. Do a little bit of smooth. Now, here's an interesting thing. I've got this little crease right there in that tight corner. I'm going to use my visibility marquee. That's Control, Shift, Click, and Drag to isolate that area. And then we go into the inside of the mesh here. And if I go to Tool, Display Properties, and turn on Double-Sided, I can now see the inside of the model. And here I can smooth from the inside, and I can fix this sort of polygon taco where that's getting turned inside out there. I can fix that area. Take the inflate brush and hold down the Alt key, and that'll negative inflate from the inside, and that'll fix that problem area. Come here to the front, take my inflate brush, and then you just inflate them normally. So that's a really nice trick there to go in and fix areas that are being a problem. You can actually sculpt from the inside. For example, if I needed to deepen the nostrils, I could just inflate from the inside, and that will pull those nostrils in. Control Shift Click on the background reveals everything again. And just going to the standard brush, think about that eye socket we were talking about. And let's do a little bit of detailing. I want to tweak that nose a little bit. Still not quite happy with the shape of that nose. Putting a little bit of asymmetry into it. Turning my symmetry back on to tweak the eye socket or the cheekbones. Turning it off again to tweak the brow here. Stepping down my subdivision levels. And I'm going to mask out, turn my X symmetry back on. I'm going to mask out the lower lid. And I just want to bring the lower lid up a little bit. I want it to be compressed up slightly by that nasolabial furrow. Mask the eye area. I just want to play around with getting a little bit more sort of malicious intent here. Just furrowing that brow, letting it come down a little bit further. Control click on the mask to feather it. There we go. That feels a little bit more intense. Just like that sharper angle there. And let's sharpen the angle here. I'm going to press down with the move brush, hold the shift key, and then drag, and that slides faces. So touch down with the move brush, press and hold the shift key. Let's clear our mask. And it will slide faces up or down or left and right along the mesh. So it's a nice little trick. There we go. All right. So let's save our work, and then we'll just do a little bit of detailing. So now we just want to put a light level of detail on here, just to break up the really smooth kind of procedural blend shader look of the whole thing. So what we'll do is, let's go ahead and turn our perspective back on. Let's go to Draw and increase our focal length. And I'm going to take the standard brush, and I'm going to switch just to one of the standard alphas, for example, alpha 56. And if you go to the alpha menu and invert it so it's actually white on black, when you come in here now and hold down the Alt key, make sure we're at our highest subdivision level. I'm actually going to add a subdivision level, so we're up to 1,000,000 polygons now. We're able to get a nice texture if we hold down the Alt key. I'm going to divide one more time, so we've just got a little bit more fidelity. Turn our Z intensity down. Hold down the Alt key, and I'm just going to make circular motions just to create a little tooth, just a little breakup in that specular highlight. And this is just a really nice kind of cross-hatched pattern. Feels a lot like skin. I'm going to turn off X symmetry when I get to the center line here. Again, anytime I'm at the center line of the mesh, I always try and turn the X symmetry off, because it's just naturally going to create symmetrical patterns that the eye will pick up on. On some level, you'll see it, and it won't feel natural. I'm not going to put detail on the back of the head because I want to show you a neat trick to do that procedurally using the noisemaker. The noisemaker is a plugin for ZBrush that allows you to create noise. We have an entire chapter on it, but we'll just dive into it a little bit here because it's really useful for breaking up that big open area of the back of the head and the torso and whatnot. So let's bring this through here, put a little bit of this skin detail down into the muzzle. Now we have a whole chapter just on detailing and alphas, so this is not our only look at this process, but I thought it would be a nice thing to add on to the very end of our tutorial here, just so we get that extra little bit of detail. Now down here in the neck area, let's switch to a different alpha. We'll do alpha 57. And again, I'm just doing that circular patterning. Just making circles with the brush, and it just creates naturally, by virtue of the stroke and the alpha, this nice cross-hatched kind of look. And I'm letting the texture get larger as we go down the torso. Turning off X symmetry, and let's just go over the center line here. Turn our draw size down a little bit. Make sure that we don't neglect the underside of the chin, things like that. Now I'm going to switch to alpha 58. Alpha 58, again, I'll hold down the Alt key. And alpha 58 is great for creating sort of like these creasing wrinkles. I really, really like this brush quite a bit. So I'm going to bring these wrinkles around through the neck here. Let's turn off X symmetry. And I just want to get some creasing in the neck here. Let these wrinkles sort of flow down underneath or over the pectoralis muscles and around this the dip there in the clavicle. And I'll radiate some of these wrinkles out from the armpit, sort of where the skin there would be buckling quite a bit. Remember that I've got X symmetry turned off right now, so I'll need to do it on both sides. And I'll come into the forehead here, turn my draw size up quite large, and I just want to give some wrinkles in the forehead area. And this alpha is really good for that sort of thing. Holding down the Alt key, let's radiate some of these wrinkles up out of the furrow here. And again, I always treat wrinkles as sort of broken up, hashed lines. I never try and make them one continuous wrinkle. I can turn on my X symmetry here at the side of the head. This is fine. Turn my draw size down, and let's bring these around into the eye area here. Let's get some nice tissuey wrinkles along the eyelids here. Turn our Z intensity up just a bit. Go into my damp standard brush again, make sure that we have our X symmetry turned on. And I just want to get that little crease right there. Just want to sharpen that up. Turn our draw size down so it's a bit sharper. There we go. And go back to our standard brush with that alpha 58. And I just want to create some wrinkle patterns coming up out of the nostrils here. Turning off our X symmetry again once we get close to the center line. We just want to bring those wrinkles out through the nose here. Turn our draw size up, and I will Control-Shift-Click on the upper mouth polygroup. And what I want to do is turn down my Z intensity and just give some wrinkles that radiate up out of the mouth area here. Maybe turn that Z intensity up just a little bit more. There we go. Again, holding down the Alt key, and I'm letting those radiate out over the nasolabial folds. Now's a good time to save our work. And we'll do the same thing for the lower jaw here. We'll isolate it, and then holding down the Alt key, let's just create some big wrinkles that radiate out and down from there. I'm going to turn up my Z intensity just a little bit. Hit that with the smooth brush. And there we go. Now, let's put some texture on the back of the head here. So I just wanted to show you a way that we can very quickly apply texture to these areas. If we just want like an overarching kind of procedural noise, I'm going to mask out this area. We'll include the ears in this as well. I'm going to step down my subdivision levels, and let's isolate the ear polygroup and mask that by Control-clicking on the background. There we go. And we'll just carry that mask up through here. And then we'll invert the mask and step all the way back up to our highest subdivision level. Now I'll go to Surface, turn on Noise, and this opens up the Noise Maker. And again, we have a whole chapter just on Noise Maker, but you navigate in here just like you navigate in the regular ZBrush window. So I can change my noise scale here, turn it down. I can change my strength, make it negative, and just give myself a nice little sort of tooth to this area, just a little bit of detail. Click OK. And there you see we've got some noise detail on there, but that's procedural. I can hide that by turning the noise on and off. So I want to bake it into the mesh by clicking Apply to Mesh. And that will then bake that down. So now that is actually part of the detail. So that's just a really quick way to add detail to a character. Perhaps you want to put a first pass down of just some noise to break up a surface before you go in and detail it manually. That's a nice way to go about doing that. Some of these wrinkles through the back of the neck. And there we go. So now this is how you import a mesh into ZBrush and then sculpt a new character from that imported mesh. If we step all the way down to our lowest subdivision level, we've maintained our topology. Any UVs would still be maintained on this mesh, so we could then extract displacement and color and normal maps from this, export that back to the originating application and export our low res, and it would be a seamless transition as long as you maintain more or less the same shapes. If I were to pull giant horns out of this or change the mesh by dynameshing it, then I would lose those elements. But because we basically imported a mesh and then used our move brush at the lowest subdivision level to shape it into a new character and then sculpted on top of that, we're able to maintain those utilities like the UVs, or if you have weight maps or anything else that rely on this topology and this these UVs, then those will transfer over. You might need to do a little bit of tweaking, but the important thing to note is very, very often you will be tasked with bringing in an existing model and then sculpting on that model. So the purpose of this chapter is to illustrate for you just how to go about doing that effectively, and also to give you some further looks at different techniques of sculpting, different brushes, using masking and polygroups. So I hope you found this chapter helpful, and you can go forward and use some of these tools and techniques in your own workflow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to restore lost symmetry, working in subdivision models and also in Dynamesh. So while we're sculpting, you might find that you're zoomed in on an area and doing a lot of work, and perhaps, I've changed the shape of this brow, for example. And because I'm zoomed in, maybe I don't realize that I don't have X symmetry turned on. So the changes that I'm making aren't propagating to the other parts of the mesh. So I'll step down my subdivision levels and just do a few changes here. We'll adjust the brow ridge, and perhaps we'll adjust the jawline, the shape of the chin, and perhaps the ear as well. Then when I zoom out, I realize these parts are only changed on one side of the mesh and not the other. Now, this isn't the end of the world. It's actually quite easy to fix this. If we're working on a subdivision model, that is a model that has multiple subdivision levels that you can step up and down with D and Shift D. Step down to your lowest subdivision level and make sure X symmetry is turned off. We'll mask one half of the model, like so. We're going to mask the side of the model that we want to retain. Then we're going to go to Tool, Deformation, and there's a button here called Smart Resim. If I click that, you'll notice that it's already set to the X-axis. I can change the axis with these two buttons, or these three buttons, X, Y, and Z, that are nested inside the main button. If I click that, you see it mirrors those changes across. What I want to do is I want to step up each subdivision level and Smart Resim each one individually. The reason we do that is because if we Smart Resim from the top subdivision level, ZBrush is going to have to compare millions of points. Whereas if we start at the lowest subdivision level and work our way up, it has to compare fewer points at a time. It gives us a more accurate result, plus it doesn't take as long. So there we go. Now, something I want to point out is this has resimmed the entire model. If I go back to before that resim, you see that this model, if I step back up to the highest subdivision, is actually asymmetrical. I've taken some care to make sure that some elements here are actually asymmetrical on their own. I've got different wrinkles in the nose, here in the mouth, on the brow. Everything is just subtly asymmetrical, and I think that's very important when you're sculpting. If I've lost my symmetry and I do a global resim, I'm going to lose that asymmetry. But here's how we fix that. What I'll do is I will go to the Tool menu, go to Morph Target, and at the highest subdivision level, in this case level 5, I'll go to Morph Target and I will store a Morph Target. Morph Targets store a copy of the mesh in memory. So if I were to make a big change to the model here, I could switch between my stored Morph Target and that changed version. You can only store one Morph Target at a time. So I'm going to delete that and we'll store it again. So I've now stored the model in its current asymmetrical state. That's the entire head, including those changes that I want to propagate over to the other side. I'm going to repeat that process. I'm going to step down. I'm going to mask the side of the model that I want to mirror across. Go to Deformation and click Smart Resim. step up, Smart Resim, step up, Smart Resim again, step up once again, Smart Resim. Then one more time, Smart Resim. There we go. Now I have symmetrized the model, but I've lost all the desirable asymmetry. So what I will do is I will go back to my morph target, and I'm going to click switch, and that switches it back to the previous version. However, the alternate, the morph target is still there, the one that is perfectly symmetrized, there. So I'm going to switch back to the asymmetrical version and go to B for brush, M for morph. The hotkey for the morph brush, as you can see, is O. Select the morph brush. Then I will simply turn up my Z intensity, and I'm going to brush those areas that I changed. Turn down my Z intensity a bit, and I can blend it off. And now I can go in here, and I can blend in those symmetrical parts that I want to keep. And maintain the asymmetrical parts that I also want to keep. So if I were to come through here and blend this out, you see that it would symmetrize the brow. Well, that's typically not an area that's symmetrical. I don't want these brow wrinkles to be the exact same on both sides. But I do want that bone structure that I changed, the ear structure, the jawline, I want those to remain symmetrical. So that is how we will resymmetrize a model that is a subdivision mesh. There's a different process that we will use if we're working in Dynamesh. Now here we have a mesh that is Dynameshed. If we look under the geometry menu, you see there are no subdivision levels and Dynamesh is turned on. If we go into frame mode, you can see that it is a Dynamesh topology. It's just evenly spaced and distributed little quads. Now, because there's no subdivision levels here, we can't use Smart Resim going up the subdivision levels to actually resymmetrize this mesh. So if I turn off my symmetry, and let's say that we've created some asymmetrical detail that we actually want to bring over to the opposite side. I'll just go to the Move brush. I'll go to my brush controls. I'm going to open up Curve, and I'm going to turn on Accurate Curve mode. That just allows me to create more of a pointed tip on my Move brush. It's really nice for creating little spines. I just want to create a nice little ridge of spines along the temple here. Just some kind of, feasible detail that we might sculpt onto a creature, accidentally making it asymmetrical, that we want to bring over to the opposite side later. So maybe let's bring one point out here from the brow. We'll turn our draw size down, put some more points like this. There we go. Okay, so let's say I want these details to actually transfer over to the other side. To do that, we're going to use a different tool. We're going to use Mirror and Weld. So to begin with, we're going to have to turn on our floor plane. Now our floor plane by default is the Y plane, like this. But I'm going to turn on the X button here and turn off Y, so it gives us the X plane. And I'm going to turn off perspective. Now I need to go to the Draw menu, and I'm going to adjust the elevation slider you find here. That changes the position of that plane. If I zoom in, you see I'm trying to place that right down the center line. So let's go to Draw again. Go to our elevation slider and put it about there, right at 0. So that's going to place it right down the center line of the model. Now I'm going to go to Geometry, Modify Topology, Mirror and Weld. X is turned on, so I'm doing it across the X-axis. I can change that axis here. So I click Mirror and Weld, and what it does is it mirrors this side over, deletes the faces that were in its place, and then welds them back together. If I go into frame mode and zoom in, sometimes you can actually see that little extra line there. There's the Mirror and Weld line. If there happens to be a seam, you can simply smooth it back with a smooth brush or sculpt over it with the Clay Tubes brush or whatever brushes you prefer. So this gives us this really nice symmetry back to our model that we lost before. So we were able to actually sculpt across this, bring some more asymmetry in, which is actually always desirable. And we can change up some of these horns just slightly, go with the Move brush, and maybe just slightly adjust their positioning just to make it a little bit more interesting. The important point is, though, that we're able to reintroduce symmetry in a Dynamesh mesh in a similar fashion that we did to the subdivision model, but using a different tool. And again, that is Mirror and Weld under the Tool Geometry menu. And this is actually quite fun for creating more surreal kind of creations. If I were to change my axis here to Y, and then go back to my floor plane and change the floor plane position, let's go to draw, and let's change our elevation. And then mirror and weld along the y-axis. See, it gives us a very unusual result. There we go. So these two heads are actually welded together. If I were to smooth across their transition, let's turn on X symmetry for that. If I smoothed across their transition, I would end up with a blend, as you can see. So this is actually really useful for creating, I find, very unusual or surreal types of forms. Sometimes I use this to create organic shapes like rocks or maybe gemstones. Sometimes just environmental elements I might use for this. Here, of course, it's completely surreal, but the important point to note is that you can actually mirror and weld across multiple axes to create different types of shapes. So in this video, we've seen two different methodologies for actually restoring symmetry that's been lost in a model. The first being the Smart Resim, and that is only for subdivision models. And the second, of course, being mirror and weld, which we use for Dynamesh meshes. So anytime that you find that you have lost your symmetry, and it will happen, rest assured you're always able to restore it. It's just a matter of knowing the right tool to use and how to go about applying it. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson. In this lecture, we're going to take an in-depth look at insert multi-mesh brushes, how to create our own IMM or insert multi-mesh brushes, as well as how to create curved brushes that insert meshes along a curve. That's both individual meshes and tripart meshes. So let's say we want to insert teeth into the mouth of this creature. So I have here a tooth that I've sculpted and decimated. This is just a mesh with no subdivision levels, and it's 109,000 faces. It's important that it be relatively low res. I want to make an insert mesh from this brush, meaning I can take that and then insert into a model that has no subdivision levels. For example, if I go to the light box, open up a polysphere, delete my lower subdivision levels, I'm able to go to B for brush, I for insert, and I have a variety of insert multi-mesh brushes here. We'll select, let's say, industrial parts. If I select the Phillips head screw, I can click and drag, and that inserts these meshes into this current subtool. They're not separate subtools, they're just part of the mesh. Clear the mask and go into frame mode, you can see that they maintain their polygroups, and they are separate but a single subtool. So we want to create one of these brushes using this tooth. Now, to store a mesh and make it an insert multi-mesh brush, you have to change the orientation so it grows out of the surface at the orientation that you want it to grow from. So for example, if I were to go to Brush, Create, and click Create Insert Mesh, I want to make a new brush. I don't want to append it into this brush. So I've created a new insert mesh brush. If I click and drag, you see it draws out, but it doesn't really draw at the orientation I would want a tooth to grow from. That's because when we create an insert mesh brush, we need to consider the background to be the surface of the model. So what I will do is I will orient the tooth so the background is the surface of the model and it's growing out roots first. So now if we go to Brush and create Insert Mesh Brush, I have the option to create a new one or append it to the existing mesh. I'll go ahead and append it. And now I have two meshes in my Insert Mesh Brush. This one, as you can see, grows out of the surface like this. Now if I want to change the depth it grows from, go to the Brush menu and go to the Depth options and turn the Depth slider down. Now if I click and drag, you see it grows embedded in the surface. So if we return here to our creature, I want to place these teeth inside the mouth. Now, this creature has multiple subdivision levels. So what I do in a case like this is I will go ahead and duplicate this model. I'll just go to duplicate, and I'm going to create a proxy mesh, which is essentially just the mouth area with everything else deleted and no subdivision levels. I'll use that proxy mesh to grow my insert mesh teeth. Then delete the proxy mesh and be left with just the teeth as a subtool. So I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm going to turn on solo mode and step down a couple more subdivision levels. I don't need a lot of detail for this proxy mesh. I'll go to the geometry menu and I will delete lower and delete higher. Then I'm going to hide everything but the mouth area, and I will go to Geometry, Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. So this is my proxy mesh. This is just the mouth area. Now I've got my Insert Multi-Mesh brush of the teeth. I'll click and drag, and that draws the teeth. But you notice that they're sticking out at not quite the right angle. So I'll go to my gizmo for Rotate, and then I'm just going to rotate them and position them, just fine-tune that positioning exactly where I want it. And because Insert Mesh brushes will automatically mask the rest of the model, I'm able to do that without affecting the proxy mesh. When I'm happy with that, I'll clear the mask, go back to Draw mode, and let's draw some more teeth here. We'll draw 2 teeth right here. Go back to our Rotate, scale those down, maybe scale them out a little bit. Clear our mask and go back to Draw mode. Now we'll turn off X symmetry because I don't want all the teeth to be perfectly symmetrical. Let's click and drag here. The brush will draw along the surface normal of the face that you click on to begin with. So that's why these are growing out at a better angle, because I'm clicking, as you can see, that one's actually I kind of like that slight rotation back. We'll just tweak it a little bit. They're picking up the surface normal of the face that I click on when I draw. Clear the mask, go back to Draw mode. Let's select our Insert Toothbrush again, make sure we have this tooth selected, and then let's click and drag to draw more of these teeth. We'll go back to Rotate and just rotate that one down slightly, maybe scale it a little bit. Go back to Draw, and we'll keep drawing teeth in this very, very scary open mouth. And we can create interesting rows of teeth, kind of like you get in a shark's mouth, where there's row after row of teeth because they just constantly restore their teeth. They lose teeth and they're constantly growing new ones. Now if I want to duplicate this particular mesh, I can simply press Control, click and drag, and it duplicates that model. That works for any tool that doesn't have subdivision levels. If you Control, click and drag on the gizmo, it will duplicate that mesh. So I can actually keep placing this particular tooth in variations here. So back to Draw, we'll draw another one right here. Let's draw one right here. Now that one picked up that face normal right there. So let's rotate down and let's draw from here. And then go to Rotate and let's rotate this one down. Make sure we get the Rotate slider and not Scale. There we go. Maybe scale that one down a little bit and scale it in X. And we'll draw another one here. Let's rotate that one and scale it. And you see we're getting this lovely set of terrifying chompers. Now remember, this is a proxy mesh. We're going to delete this mesh at some point. We're just using it as a base that we can draw our teeth into. We'll go back into X symmetry and let's draw a couple more teeth here. As I draw, if I move my brush up and down, I can scale and sort of shear these insert meshes. I can rotate and change their orientation while I'm drawing. Let's draw some more down here. Put some little ones here. Now if I'm happy with that, we'll clear the mask. Now I want to get rid of that proxy mesh, so I simply Control-Shift-Click on the proxy mesh twice to hide it. That leaves the teeth visible, and I go to Geometry, Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. So I've now deleted the proxy mesh of the face. If I turn off Solo, there's the original model where I extrapolated my proxy mesh from, and there are the teeth in the mouth. Now, sometimes you might want to insert a mesh along a curve. So let's take a look at how we do that. If we go back to our tooth, currently we're drawing out a single tooth. However, if I were to go to the stroke menu and go to curve and turn on curve mode, I can draw these teeth along a curve like this. However, you notice the orientation is once again incorrect. The reason for that is when we stored this insert mesh, we stored it like this. So we have the orientation right for how the tooth grows out of the surface. However, with the background as the surface of the model, we also need to imagine a curve that runs straight up and down the screen. So if we want these to draw correctly along a curve, we need to store them in this orientation, so they're running along the curve face out. So I'll go to Brush, Create Insert Mesh, and let's just append this one. So this one is ready for use with the curve brush. So if I go to Stroke, make sure Curve Mode is turned on, and then we draw along a curve, we'll get teeth oriented correctly, like this. So let's go back to our creature's mouth, and we'll create another proxy mesh. We'll just select the body, go to Subtool and Duplicate, go to Geometry, and just step down a few subdivision levels, delete lower, delete higher, go to Solo Mode, and we'll hide everything but the mouth, and go to Geometry, Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. So now let's say we want to create a nice row of teeth along the inside of the mouth here. I have this tooth selected. Under Stroke, I have Curve Mode turned on. So if I click and drag, you see we get these teeth running along this curve. So I can adjust this curve by clicking and dragging it. And then if I want to change the depth, I go to Brush, Depth, bring the depth slider down, and then just click the curve, and the teeth will update their depth, just like that. So I'll tap somewhere off the model to get rid of the curve, and then I can always take the Move brush if I like, and maybe do a little bit of tweaking asymmetrically using the Move brush. And there we have our first row of teeth. Now, let's say I want these teeth to change size along the curve. So I'm going to go back to my tooth. I'll go to the Stroke menu, and I will open up Curve Modifiers. I'll go to Size, and open up Curve Fall Off. Now I'm going to bring this start point up. This is the size of the teeth at the first beginning of the curve. This is the size of the teeth at the end of the curve. And then if I click in the middle and bring this point up, I can make the teeth get larger and then get smaller again. So let's take a look at that in action. I'll turn my draw size down, and I'll draw a new row of teeth right here. And here you see it draws those teeth again, but they go from small to large to small. Go back to Brush, turn our depth control down, and let's click that curve to make them embed a little bit more in the body. Tap somewhere off the model. Actually, let's turn on X symmetry. Let's adjust that curve. And now we'll get 2 rows of teeth. Tap somewhere off the model to get rid of our curve, and then clear the mask. So now I have these 2 rows of teeth that were created using Insert Mesh along a curve. Let's hide the head by just Control-Shift clicking on it twice. Go to Geometry, Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. Now if we turn off Solo Mode, you see that we've got those extra rows of teeth added into the inner mouth there, and that's looking particularly wicked. Now let's take a look at how we can create an Insert Multi-Mesh brush from a Z-tool with multiple subtools. Here I have a Z-tool of a human skeleton, and inside the Z-tool I have various subtools for the different bones. If I turn on Solo Mode, you can see I have scapulas, I have the humerus, I have the skull, the hyoid bone, I have the bones of the feet. Come down here, we've got individual teeth, rib cage, pelvis. Anytime I have a Z-tool with multiple subtools, I can simply go to Brush, Create, and select Create Insert Multi-Mesh, and that will automatically create an Insert Multi-Mesh brush based on those subtools. So here if I want to insert a skull, I select the skull. Let's go ahead and select a mesh that doesn't have subdivision levels, and I can insert a skull. Go to Scapulas, I can insert scapulas. I quite like inserting rib cages here, so let's turn on our X symmetry. We can insert rib cages and make some very disturbing, macabre rib cage art. So anytime I have a Z-tool with multiple subtools, I can automatically turn those subtools into insert meshes, which is really handy. If you've got a whole bunch of various bits and bobs that you've modeled over the years, you can put them together into a single subtool and then make an insert mesh brush from them. One thing that I will point out is anytime you've got this this type of brush, you need to make sure that your individual insert meshes are not too dense, because right now I'm already at 3 million polygons with those insert meshes. So you might find it beneficial to go in and decimate your parts using Decimation Master before you create an insert mesh brush from them. If you want to learn more about Decimation Master, there is a separate video where we talk just about Decimation Master. So in addition to just a standard insert mesh brush or insert along a curve, there is another type of brush which is very, very useful, and those are called tripart brushes. If I go to B for brush, I for insert, you'll find that there's a brush called IMM Zipper. Now if I select IMM Zipper and then click and drag, this is a curve-based brush, and you see what this does is it draws a zipper along a curve. Now you'll notice there are 3 polygroups to this. There's a polygroup for the beginning of the curve, which is the zipper pull. There is a polygroup for the teeth of the zipper, and this is actually a repeating mesh. And there's a polygroup for the end of the zipper. And if I go to the brush menu and I go to samples, not samples, go to modifiers. You see this is a tripart brush. It has tripart turned on. Now there's also the option to weld points, but because this doesn't need its points welded, we don't use that. However, I'm going to show you how to make a brush like this, which is an O-ring, a continuous leather strap, and then a terminating O-ring. So let's take a look at how we do that. I'm just going to start with a polystar. I'm going to go to the gizmo gear, and I'm going to change this to a polycube. The default resolution is just fine. I'm going to scale this in the z-axis, and I'm going to scale it in the x-axis. Now I am going to control click and drag to duplicate this. I'm going to bring this forward, and I'm going to scale it in y and scale it in x. Now I'm going to append another polystar. I'll select that polystar. Let's turn off solo, and we'll turn this into ring 3D. We'll bring this over here, bring it forward. This is going to be our O-ring at the end of each strap. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's select this mesh here, and I'll just go to the move brush, and we'll just scooch this strap so it feels like it's conforming around the inside of that ring. We can maybe even pull these faces down just a little bit. So there we go. Now I will select that ring. I will go to deformation. I will mirror it across the x-axis. Actually, we need to duplicate it first. So I'll go to Subtool, Duplicate, Deformation, Mirror across the x-axis. That gives us a new one of those. Let's select our leather strap here and clear the mask, and we'll go ahead and duplicate that. I'll go to Subtool, Duplicate, and we'll do the same thing. I'm just going to go to Deformation and mirror that across the x-axis. Now, I don't need 2 of the strap itself, so I will go to Polygroups, Auto Group, and I'm going to delete that extra strap area by going to Geometry, Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. So now I've got these subtools, and I actually want these all grouped together. So I'm going to go to the top of the list here and click Merge, Merge Down, and just click Always OK. I'm going to merge all of these down into one subtool. Now the way this works is we need 3 separate polygroups for the tripart brush to work. I am going to isolate everything but this first section. This will be the first mesh that's drawn along my curve. I will go to Polygroups, Group Visible. Now I will invert that mask, and I'm going to hide these faces. Make sure that I get these faces here. There we go. So I get the center faces of my strap. You see, I've hidden everything but those center faces. I'm going to click Group Visible. Now I've got 2 polygroups and then these extra bits here, which are all polygrouped separately. So I'm going to hide these 2 and then Group Visible for these. So now I have 3 polygroups. I have the start polygroup, which will be the O-ring and the strap. I have this polygroup, which will be duplicated along the length of the curve, and then this polygroup, which will be drawn at the end of the curve. Now we're going to store this as an insert mesh brush. So remember, we want to store it at the correct orientation. The curve runs straight up and down the screen, and the background is the surface of the model. So I will go to Brush, Create, Create Insert Mesh, New. So I now have a new insert mesh brush. I will go to Stroke, turn on Curve Mode, and now I'm going to draw this along a curve. And you see, because it has 3 polygroups, ZBrush is smart enough to know if we go to Samples to turn, not Samples, always do that. Go to Modifiers. ZBrush is smart enough to know to turn on Triparts. But you notice that the strap is not welding, so I need to turn on Weld Points. Just tap the curve, and now it's automatically going to weld those points along the length of that curve. So now I can easily create this type of strap with a continuous curve duplicating that leather band with the 2 O-rings on either side. If I go back to a polysphere, and because it's an insert mesh brush, we need to delete our lower subdivision levels. So let's delete those. Let's zoom into this, and then we'll take this curve and we can draw it along the surface like this. Or a really great trick, if you're trying to put a costume detail on someone, start drawing your curve and then press and hold the Shift key, and that will create this ring that wraps that stroke along that surface, so you can very easily put a belt or a strap on someone. Now, of course, if you wanted to smooth this, you could just turn on dynamic subdivision levels, and that will give you a smooth on that curve. So now you can see what this is going to look like once it's actually smoothed. Because remember, you can't use subdivision levels with an insert mesh brush. You have to then use dynamic subdivision levels until such point that you want to bake them down. You do that by going to Geometry, Dynamic Subdivision Levels, and apply them. If you want to learn more about dynamic subdivision levels, we talk about it again in the video on ZModeler. So here you can see we've actually baked this down with subdivision levels. Now, the insert mesh brushes are incredibly powerful. There's another chapter where we talk specifically about using insert mesh brushes with Dynamesh to create entire characters using them. Also the curve brushes, as well as more details on using the insert mesh brushes to add mechanical details. But I wanted to create a separate standalone chapter where we just talk about how to create the different types of insert meshes and how to create them using subtools and how to create them using tripart brushes. So I hope you found this video helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next chapter. Thanks for watching. In this lecture, we're going to talk about vector displacement brushes as well as 3D alphas. We're going to begin by looking at vector displacement brushes. Vector displacement brushes use the vector displacement map technology inside of ZBrush to allow us to create a brush that, instead of a standard displacement map, which has grayscale values that either push in or out, a vector displacement map allows us to displace around a compound curve, meaning this shape here, which curves back over itself, this can be displaced. And that is accomplished with a vector displacement map. Now, those can be generated for geometry and exported. Vector displacement maps are a form of displacement map that can be rendered in external applications. However, in this implementation, ZBrush is using that technology to create a special type of brush. So here you see we've got this sort of alien tongue. Now, I'm going to orient it facing the viewer just like we would any other insert mesh brush. I will go to B for brush, C for chisel, and I'll select the Chisel 3D brush. And that gives us a variety of sort of creature parts here. Now I'm going to go to brush, and I am going to go to create. And under create, or just above create, we have from mesh. Now ZBrush is smart enough to look at this mesh and say, well, this has been sculpted out of this 2D plane or this 3D plane. So it will automatically store this as a vector displacement brush. So I go to brush and I click from mesh, and you see it will add it into the stack here. There we are. There's our tongue. So let's test this out. Let's go ahead and create a polysphere. I'll just go to the polystar, go to the gizmo gear, and let's change this to a polysphere. Now, I want to divide this up so it's dense enough that it can actually support the level of detail in this brush. So let's divide until we get to about 6 million polygons. 5.8, that should be good. So we have our tongue selected here in the chisel brush. So let's turn on X symmetry. We'll draw 2 of these. I'm going to click and drag, and you see what happens is it draws that shape out, captures all that detail and that compound curvature. Now, if this was a standard alpha, it would look something like this. It would just be a grayscale image that didn't contain that compound curvature. It wouldn't be able to displace back on itself. Now, for these to work effectively, you need to make sure that you're using it on a tool that has enough subdivision levels to support the level of detail that we want. So let's take a look at another way we can create these. Over here, I'm going to go to Teeth. And this is a series of subtools. If I turn on Solo, you'll see I've just got a series of planes here from which I've sculpted a variety of teeth. So I'm going to select that. I will turn off Solo, and I'm going to go to Brush. And here I have Create Multi-Alpha Brush. I will click that, and once again, here we go. There we are. You see we have our teeth added in to our Chisel 3D brush. So let's go back to the sphere. Select our Chisel 3D brush. Oops. There we go. And let's draw these on. And you see what we're getting is those individual teeth that we created growing out of this surface. So we were able to generate these in a similar way that we did a multi-mesh insert mesh brush, where we had various subtools, and then we were able to automatically turn each one of those into an alpha in this stack. Now this is becoming a very wicked looking creature here. So how do we create these? Well, let's take a look. I'm going to go ahead and reset all of my brushes by going to the brush menu and click Reset All Brushes. Now that's going to return my Chisel 3D brush back to normal. See, it's got all of its pieces in there. And let's go ahead and take a look at how we create our own vector displacement brushes. To do so, I'm going to open up the light box. In the light box, I'm going to open the project folder, and in projects you'll find miscellaneous. Double click on that, and you'll find a variety of Brush 3D templates here. The two most important ones I think are 1024, or my favorite one here, which is template PG. That stands for Polygroup. If I double click that, we don't need to save the changes. It's going to open up this. It's a polymesh plane, and it's polygrouped around the border. Now, ZBrush knows when you go to Brush from Mesh, if you are storing a displacement brush that is from a mesh that's been sculpted from a plane like this, ZBrush is smart enough to say, well, that's going to be a vector displacement brush. There's another method of doing this called 3D alphas, which we're going to talk about shortly. Those are just created from random geometry. For example, I could create an alpha from this piece of geometry here. Because it's not sculpted from a plane, ZBrush is going to store that as a 3D alpha, whereas anything we sculpt from this will be stored as a vector displacement brush. So if we go into the geometry menu, you can see that we actually have several subdivision levels on this plane already. The reason the perimeter is polygrouped is because when you're working with these brushes, you do not want to disturb the perimeter of this plane. You also do not want to change the topology of this mesh. That means you cannot dynamesh this. All you can do is add subdivision levels and sculpt on the subdivision mesh. Now you could potentially shrink wrap or project this plane onto another object, but the most important thing is you cannot change the topology of the plane itself. It has to only go up or down subdivision levels. So to begin, let's go ahead and mask out a little area here. Let's invert that mask, and I'll take the move brush, and let's just start shaping something here. Let's turn off perspective for a moment, just pull this out. Now obviously we're at a pretty low subdivision level here. Let's smooth this back and just get the most basic shape in. Create maybe a horn here. Let's step up our subdivision levels, smooth this a bit. Let's take advantage of the fact that it's a vector displacement map and get that compound curvature in there. Now I'm keeping the rest of the plane masked there because I don't want to impact that perimeter. But because it's polygrouped, I'll be able to actually hide that quite easily. So I'm just using the pinch brush on the tip of the horn. And let's step up to our highest subdivision level here. Let's clear the mask and let's leave frame mode. I'm going to Control-Shift-Click on the horn, and that's just hiding that perimeter ring of faces. Just going to make life a little bit easier here while we sculpt. I'm going to take the damn standard brush and maybe add some striations going up the length of this horn. Just trying to make things look a little bit interesting. Hold down the Alt key. I like using the Alt key with the damn standard brush because it pinches up and out in a really interesting way. It's fun to combine that with just the regular use of the damn standard brush. Let's scooch these in. Maybe take the move brush and taper this, bring this out a little bit. And let's go to the damn standard brush again and maybe put some striations running the opposite way around the horn this way. Holding down the Alt key just to pinch those up. I'm not too worried about symmetry here because you'll never see the front and the back at the same time. So I can get away with using the symmetry brush. Just adding more detail. Now obviously we're running out of geometry here at the tip, so we're only at 231,000 faces, so let's add another couple of subdivision levels here. Now I need to make sure that I reveal my hidden faces and clear any masking I have, and then we'll Control D a couple times, and that brings us up to 4 million faces. Just to be careful, I'm going to Control Shift click on the horn to hide that outer perimeter again, because I really don't want to accidentally move that, because that will mess up the perimeter of your brush, and we don't want that. Let's go ahead and run some more striations along here, this way. Hold down the Alt key, hold down the Alt key, do a little bit of pinching here. Now let's add some little spikes. I'm going to go to the Move brush, and I'll go to the Brush menu. I'll go to Curve and turn on Accurate Curve mode. And this is a lot of fun for pulling out little spiky bits like this. Maybe we'll put some spines along the edges of the horn like that. Zoom down here to the tip. Hold down the Alt key, and we'll just pull up some spikes here along the very, very end point. Pull some spikes out along here. And I'm going to come down to the base where it's going to actually meet the skin. Go to the damn standard brush, and let's go ahead and create some sense of this horn interacting with the skin around it. I'll go to the standard brush with Alpha 1. Now remember, I have that outermost polygroup hidden, so the area that I can see right now, it's actually safe for me to sculpt on this. I might even step down a couple subdivision levels just to make it a little bit easier to make some kind of big forms, some big undulating kind of wrinkles down here. Do a little bit of smooth down there. Take the standard brush. And then we'll step back up to our highest subdivision level. Now it is possible to use other vector displacement brushes on this piece and incorporate them into my new vector displacement. I'm going to go to B for brush, C for chisel, and I'll grab chisel creature. This is a variety of different creature parts. I'm going to grab these little teeth here. And I'm going to use these to create more little spines along the horn here. Let's just drag them out like so. Now if we zoom in, you can see we're actually running out of geometry there. So I'm going to undo those. And we're only at 3 million polygons. So let's reveal everything again by Control Shift clicking on the background. Make sure that we get that outermost polygroup. Clear any masking, and then Control D. And that will add another subdivision level here, giving us 16 million faces. Control Shift click on that polygroup just to be safe. We want to make sure that the perimeter polygroup is hidden. And now we should be able to get a better result. Much, much better. So we can add these little spikes running along the length of this horn. Maybe we'll put some on the side here. So we're really able to take multiple vector displacement brushes, combine them together, and make new pieces. It's sort of the definition of kit bashing. There we go. Let's do a couple more right here. So now that we have this horn sculpted, how do we turn this into a vector displacement brush? Well, the first thing, most important, is remember you have the outer perimeter hidden. Control Shift click on the background to reveal that polygroup. If you fail to do that, the map that's created will not be accurate. It won't have the full displacement. So make sure you do that. Now orient the shape on screen in the manner that you want it to grow out of the surface. Now I'm going to go to B for brush, C for chisel, and let's just select the Chisel 3D brush, which has a variety of different 3D objects in here sculpted from planes. I will go to brush and I will press from mesh, and ZBrush is smart enough to see that this was sculpted from a 2D or 3D plane, and therefore it will generate a vector displacement brush from it. Now remember, we have 16 million polygons here, so it might take a moment for it to generate that brush, but it will do it. And here we go. You can see that it has generated and added it to the end of this list. So let's pop over here to a polymesh sphere that I've pre-prepared. It's at 5 million faces. There's 9 subdivision levels. So if we turn on our X symmetry and then just click and drag, you see it draws those horns on that surface. And you see all that sculpting that we did around the base comes in handy. It helps transition those shapes down into the surface you're growing them from. So anything that you can sculpt from that plane, you can then generate a vector displacement brush from it. And if you want to save this, you can simply save the plane itself that you sculpted from, or save your brush by going to Brush, Save As. Now, that is vector displacement. Again, that's only generated when you use one of those 3D planes that I showed you at the project folder. Zbrush knows anything that's sculpted from a plane like that will generate a vector displacement brush. You cannot change the topology, and you cannot change the perimeter of that mesh or that plane. Make sure you use the polygroup version just for the ease of isolating the border, and be sure to show that border again before you generate the map. Otherwise, it'll throw off all the levels. So another thing before we move on, I'd like to show you the strokes here. If we change from the drag rectangle to the spray stroke and then use a vector displacement brush, we can spray those displaced objects on the surface. So it makes these interesting little spines or spikes. It's really cool with teeth, or if you're doing maybe an insect that has spines. So let's take a look at this with some teeth that I sculpted. Here I have a series of planes from which I've sculpted a variety of different little sharp teeth. So they've got transitional areas sculpted down into the plane itself, and each one is a slightly different shape. So just like our Insert Multi-Mesh tool, if we want to generate a new vector displacement brush from these planes all at the same time, go to Brush, Create. There's Create Multi-Alpha Brush. Click that. It's going to actually create a new brush, replacing what was in the currently selected brush, so be aware of that. So if you save this as a different brush, you now have a vector displacement brush with a series of different teeth that can be inserted as vector displacement maps, or vector displacement brushes, I should say. The brushes do use a vector displacement map to function. So we'll just save this out, like so. Now if we return to our polymesh sphere where we've added the horns, we'll take this toothbrush. Let's undo so we have a clean slate to work from. Let's move down here, and there we go. We can start to spray those teeth on, which makes a rather unsettling effect. So we change to a different tooth here, spray those on. This, again, it works great for spines or bits of hair. It's perfect for anything where you want to get a nice distribution of little tendrils or spikes on a surface. So that's using the spray stroke, and of course you can change your flow and you can change your placement to adjust how they're clustered and how they're placed onto the surface. I find that very disturbing. That looks really upsetting. So it's a neat trick and a really cool variation on how you can create your own vector displacement brushes from a series of subtools like this rather than just one plane at a time. And that's simply selecting a Z tool that has multiple plane subtools. Go to Brush while you have the chisel brush selected and create multi-alpha, and that will reset everything in that brush. So if you need to get it back, reset all brushes. So if we go back to the chisel brush now, you'll see that it returns it to its original state. And then if I go to Brush, Load Brush, and we load up that brush that we saved, now we have our tooth chisel brush as a separate brush. So that is vector displacement brushes. Now let's move on and take a look at 3D alphas and creating those for brushes.